I was driving through a blinding storm toward my lakeside cabin when my dashboard suddenly spoke. "Do not turn right." I froze. The screen was black and I was not even using a GPS system. Then the strange encrypted voice echoed again over the static of the dead radio. "Trust me. Keep driving straight." 3 minutes later, when I reached the turn and saw what happened, my blood ran cold. I realized my own family had just tried to bury me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against the people who took your sacrifices for granted. My name is James Bennett. I am 65 years old, and for the last 5 years, I thought I was simply enduring the natural distance that grows between an aging father and an ambitious son. I was completely wrong. The truth was far more sinister, and it all unraveled on a treacherous stretch of mountain road during the worst rainstorm of the season. The rain hammered against the windshield of my aging truck with an aggressive, deafening rhythm. I was navigating the winding, dangerous access road that led up to the lakeside cabin. I had built that cabin with my own bare hands 30 years ago for my late wife, Martha. It was my sanctuary. It was the only place where I could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the city and the increasingly cold, dismissive treatment I received from my son Aaron and his wife Vanessa. They constantly nagged me to sell the property. Aaron called it a tax liability. Vanessa called it a useless shack for an old man losing his grip on reality. Just the night before, Aaron had asked me exactly what time I was leaving for the mountain. He had stared at me with a hollow, calculating look, urging me to leave before dusk. I thought he was just being practical about the incoming weather. I had no idea he was confirming the schedule for my execution. The truck tires slipped slightly on the slick asphalt as I approached the steepest incline of the route. I reached out to adjust the radio dial, seeking some distraction from the storm. Suddenly, the classic rock station I was listening to cut out. A sharp, piercing hiss of static filled the cabin. I tapped the dial, assuming the storm had knocked out the signal. But the static did not stop. It shifted, morphed, and then a heavily digitized robotic voice bled directly through my speakers. "Do not turn right." My hands clamped down on the steering wheel. I stared at the dashboard. My phone was buried deep in my jacket pocket, completely disconnected from any Bluetooth system. My truck was an old model. It did not have a built-in navigation screen, no smart features, no GPS. It was just a machine of steel and wire. Yet the voice had come through with crystal clarity, overriding the radio frequency entirely. I checked my rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness and sheets of rain. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, the fatigue of the long drive manifesting as auditory hallucinations. I shook my head and pressed my foot lightly on the brake, preparing for Dead Man Curve. It was a notorious blind right turn that skirted the edge of a plunging ravine, the only route to my property. If you missed that turn, you added 40 minutes to your journey navigating the switchbacks. The static hissed again, louder this time, filling the small space of the cab with an unnatural urgency. "Trust me. Keep driving straight." Every survival instinct I had developed from surviving alone on the streets since I was 15 years old screamed at me to listen. My life had taught me that paranoia was just another word for awareness. You do not survive decades in the cutthroat logistics business by ignoring the hairs standing up on the back of your neck. The turn was approaching fast. Through the relentless sweep of the windshield wipers, I could barely make out the reflective arrows marking the sharp right bend. I had taken this turn hundreds of times. My foot hovered over the brake pedal. "Do not turn right." The encrypted voice echoed in my head, cold and precise. I made a split-second decision. I ignored logic. I ignored my routine. I slammed my heavy boot down on the accelerator instead of the brake. The truck roared, surging forward. I gripped the wheel and blew straight past the blind right turn, rocketing down the straightaway into the unknown darkness. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I pulled the truck onto a muddy gravel shoulder a safe distance away and killed the headlights, leaving the engine running. I sat in the pitch-black cabin, my breath coming in short, rapid bursts. I grabbed my phone from my pocket. The screen was completely dark. No signal. No connection. I stared back down the road, toward the turn I had just abandoned. 3 agonizing minutes ticked by. The rain continued to assault the roof of my truck. I began to feel foolish. I began to think Vanessa was right, that my mind was finally failing me, that I was an old man losing his sanity to the ghosts of his past. Then the ground began to vibrate. It was a low mechanical rumble that overpowered the sound of the storm. I squinted through the rain-washed window. Out of the darkness, roaring down the opposing lane of the blind curve, came a massive logging truck. It was completely blacked out. No headlights, no running lights. It was a ghost machine moving at a lethal speed. It did not brake for the curve. It did not attempt to turn. The behemoth accelerated with terrifying violence, plowing directly through the exact intersection where my driver's side door would have been if I had taken the turn. The sound of tearing metal and shattering wood pierced the night as the logging truck obliterated the reinforced steel guardrail. The massive vehicle launched into the empty air, plummeting over the edge of the cliff. Seconds later, a deafening, earth-shaking crash echoed up from the bottom of the ravine, followed by a thick plume of black smoke rising into the storm. I sat frozen in my seat, unable to breathe. If I had turned right, I would have been crushed, instantly swept over the edge into the abyss, just another tragic statistic on a dangerous mountain road. The shock of survival rapidly evaporated, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp realization. The logging truck was completely dark. It was timed perfectly. The driver was not out of control. He was executing a blindside intercept. Someone had meticulously orchestrated my death. They knew my route. They knew my schedule. They knew the exact minute I would reach that treacherous turn. And someone else entirely had hacked into my vehicle to save my life. I did not call the police. Calling the authorities meant waiting on a dark road, while whoever orchestrated this hit monitored the police scanners. I put the truck in gear, keeping the headlights off until I was miles away from the crash site. My mind worked with cold, mechanical precision. I pulled into an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of the city, shielded by the storm. I reached into my glove box, pulling out a heavy flashlight and a multi-tool. I jammed the flathead screwdriver into the seams of my dashboard paneling. I ripped the plastic casing away with brute force, exposing the tangled wires behind the radio interface. I dug my fingers into the mess of cables, tracing the lines, until my hand brushed against something cold, metallic, and completely foreign. I yanked it out. It was a small military-grade two-way tracking and communication module. It was spliced directly into my power supply and audio system. Someone had physically planted this device inside my truck. They had been tracking my every movement, mapping my routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But the voice that saved me had hijacked the frequency to deliver the warning. I stared at the blinking red light on the device. The only people who had unrestricted access to my truck were the mechanics at the logistics firm I founded, the firm I had handed over to my son. The only people who knew my exact departure time tonight were Aaron and Vanessa. I crushed the plastic casing of the module under my boot, carefully extracting the tiny SIM card and slipping it into my shirt pocket. The sadness of betrayal had no room to exist. It was instantly consumed by a smoldering, absolute rage. My own blood had put a price on my head. They thought I was a weak, vulnerable old man who would simply disappear in an unfortunate accident. They were about to discover that the man who built an empire from the gutter does not die quietly. I turned the truck around, aiming back toward the city, heading straight for the home of my would-be murderers. I pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder of the mountain road, my hands finally ceasing their involuntary shaking. The rain was relentless, battering the metal roof like a drum solo for the dead. I didn't reach for my phone to call the police. I didn't reach for the door handle to run. I knew better. I reached into the glove box and grabbed the heavy rusted multi-tool, a gift from the man who used to call me Dad, and began tearing into the dashboard. Why did I trust him? Why did I pour 45 years of love and sweat into a vessel that was rotting from the inside. My hands moved with a cold, surgical precision that terrified me. I was not just fixing a truck. I was performing an autopsy on my own life. Behind the radio unit, tangled in a nest of aftermarket wiring, I found the anomaly. It wasn't standard. It was a matte black box the size of a cigarette pack, with a microscopic antenna LED snaking toward the roof. Military grade. A GPS relay, a long-range audio transmitter, the works. This wasn't something you bought at an auto parts store. This was something someone with significant resources and a dark agenda had installed. I held the module in my palm. It felt heavy. It felt like an indictment. Someone had tracked my every turn, every stop, every quiet moment of reflection at the cabin for months. The logging truck driver hadn't been lucky. He had been coordinated. That turn was the kill zone, and the voice that distorted digital warning voice, it had overridden the vehicle's frequency. It didn't belong to a friend. It sounded like something pulled from a Black Ops thriller. I snapped the casing open with my tool. Inside was a tiny SIM card. I carefully pocketed the chip and tossed the empty black box into the mud. I was alone in the dark, miles from anywhere, and I was suddenly vividly aware that I was an obstacle to be erased. The realization didn't make me cry. It didn't make me weak. It turned my grief into a furnace. Who knew my route? Who knew the exact time I would be passing that curve? Only 2 people in this world had that kind of access to my schedule. Aaron and his wife, Natalie, my own son who I had spent decades lifting up, and the woman he brought into our lives, who had always looked at me as an aging nuisance blocking her path to the family wealth. The chain of events was now perfectly clear. They didn't just want me out of the house. They wanted me dead. They wanted the insurance, the assets, the life I had built to be theirs without the inconvenience of my presence. The betrayal wasn't impulsive. It was a slow burn operation. They had been counting the days, measuring the risk, and finally they had decided it was time to cash in. I didn't have the luxury of mourning. I couldn't go to the police yet. They would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. They would tip off the people who had tried to kill me, and they would see me as the old man who finally lost his mind in a rainstorm. I had to go back to the city. I had to return to the den of vipers. If I didn't show up, if I didn't play the part of the confused, grieving father, they would simply initiate Plan B, and Plan B would be much, much harder to survive. I climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine turned over with a low, throaty grumble. I had a SIM card that could link a murder attempt to my own blood, and I had the resolve to use it. I was going to walk back into that house, look them in the eye, and pretend I was the man they expected, the weak, gullible, dying patriarch. But while I drank their coffee and listened to their fake, hollow concern, I would be watching. I would be recording. I would be building the scaffold. The mountain road felt longer on the return trip. Every shadow cast by the passing headlights felt like a threat. But I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. I reached the main highway, and the city lights began to glow in the distance, a sprawling neon-lit labyrinth of secrets. My home, or the place I once called home, waited for me. It was where the betrayal had been born, and it would be the place where I would dismantle it piece by piece. My son thought he knew me. My daughter-in-law thought she had already won. They were about to learn that the most dangerous man on earth is the one who has nothing left to lose. I parked the truck 3 blocks from the house. I checked my reflection in the window. The man looking back wasn't the defeated, tired father who had left that morning. There was a hardness in my eyes, a set jaw, and a focus that cut through the exhaustion. I walked toward the front door, feeling the rain soak into my clothes. I checked my pockets one last time for the SIM card. It was secure. I had the keys in my hand. I had the resolve in my heart. As I reached the porch, I could see the glow of the living room lights through the curtains. They were probably inside, waiting. Probably checking their phones, checking the GPS coordinates, waiting for the news that the truck had finished its job. I imagined their disappointment when they heard the news that I was alive, when they saw me walk through that door, still breathing, still watching. I didn't knock. I used my key, turning it slowly, deliberately. The lock clicked, a sound that seemed to echo through the silence of the night. I stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I took off my boots, leaving them on the mat. I walked toward the living room, my movements as silent as a cat. They were sitting on the sofa, a bottle of champagne open on the table. They were celebrating. They were celebrating the end of my life. I stood in the doorway, unseen, listening to them. The sound of their voices made me want to scream, to lash out, to destroy everything. But I didn't. I stood there, a ghost watching the living, a man preparing to reclaim his soul from the very people who had tried to sell it for pieces of silver. I cleared my throat. The sound was small, but in the silence of the room it was like a gunshot. The three of them jumped. Aaron dropped his glass. The champagne spilled onto the carpet. Natalie went pale. Olivia. My granddaughter gasped. They looked at me as if they were seeing a dead man walking. And in a way I was. The man they knew was dead. And I was the one who was about to bury them. "Welcome home," I said, my voice steady, my heart cold. I hope I didn't interrupt anything important. The look on their faces was priceless. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. They knew the game had changed. They knew they had failed. And they knew that the nightmare was just beginning. Welcome home, indeed. The rain had not let up by the time I pulled into the driveway of Aaron and Natalie's townhouse. The structure was a towering monument to clinical modernism, all sharp angles, glass panels, and cold steel. It looked less like a home and more like an exclusive corporate lobby, a place designed solely for displaying wealth rather than living a life. I killed the engine of my truck and sat in the dark for a long moment, letting the freezing rain pound against the windshield. I needed to compose myself. I needed to take the blazing fury burning in my chest and bury it deep down where they could not see it. I had to look the part. I needed to look like an exhausted, confused old man who had simply given up on a difficult drive through the mountains. I stepped out of the truck and let the icy downpour soak right through my heavy canvas work jacket. I walked up the concrete steps and pushed the heavy oak front door open with my spare key. The warmth of the house hit me instantly, carrying the rich, heavy scent of catered food and expensive red wine. The ambient sound of a jazz record played softly from unseen high-end speakers hidden in the ceiling. They were in the massive open-concept kitchen. The kitchen island was a gigantic slab of flawless white marble. Aaron and Natalie sat on sleek leather bar stools, a bottle of wine open between them, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting. They did not jump when the heavy front door shut behind me. They did not rush out to the hallway to see who was entering their home so late at night during a severe storm. They barely even looked up from their drinks. I stood in the entryway, water pooling around my heavy boots, dripping onto the pristine imported Persian rug Natalie had purchased just last spring. I waited. I waited for the question. I waited for my son to ask why his 65-year-old father, who was supposed to be navigating a treacherous mountain pass in a deadly storm, was standing in his hallway, shivering. The question never came. Natalie finally turned her head. Her eyes swept over my soaked, mud-splattered jacket, bypassing my face entirely, and landing immediately on the dark, dirty water, staining her expensive rug. She let out a sharp, exaggerated sigh of pure disgust. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not ask if my truck had broken down on the mountain or if I had been in an accident. She simply set her crystal wine glass on the marble counter with a sharp, echoing clink. "James," she snapped, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Look at what you are doing. We just had these floors professionally treated. Can you not take your muddy boots off outside like a normal person?" I shifted my gaze from the ruined rug to my son. Aaron stared at me. It was not a look of annoyance over dirty floors. It was a dark, penetrating, calculating glare. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching violently beneath his skin. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at a man he had paid to erase from the earth. I could see the gears turning in his head, watching him calculate how I survived. He was wondering if I knew. He was wondering if the truck driver had missed the target, or if I had simply turned around before the trap was sprung. I kept my face completely blank. I let my shoulders slump heavily toward the floor. I gave them the tired, defeated posture of an aging man beaten by the weather and his own failing body. The roads were washed out, I mumbled, staring at my boots, letting my voice waver just enough to sound fragile. I could not see the turns in the dark. I had to come back. Aaron did not offer me a towel. He did not offer me a warm drink or a chair to sit in. He stood up slowly from his stool, smoothed the front of his perfectly tailored designer shirt, and walked over to a sleek leather briefcase resting on the far edge of the island. He unclasped the brass locks, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, crisp and heavy, and slid them across the white marble. The papers stopped right in front of where I stood. "You are losing your grip, Dad," Aaron said. His voice was cold, completely devoid of any familial warmth or basic human empathy. "You cannot even handle a simple drive to the lake anymore. It is getting pathetic." He tapped the top of the document with his index finger. "We need to handle this tonight. I have the notary coming first thing in the morning. Sign the deed transfer for the cabin." I looked down at the papers. The lakeside cabin. The only place left in the world that smelled like my late wife, Martha. I had laid every pine log, driven every nail, and built it from the ground up when Aaron was just a boy. It was not just a piece of real estate. It was the anchor of my life. And he wanted it. I shook my head slowly, rubbing my temple, as if confused, playing the part of the bewildered elder they believed me to be. They truly thought I was just a broke, dependent pensioner. They had conveniently forgotten that the massive regional logistics firm Aaron currently ran was built from scratch by my own 2 hands after I survived alone on the streets at 15. I handed him the daily operations 5 years ago, choosing to live a simple Spartan lifestyle, but I quietly retained ultimate veto power through a blind holding company. I played the fool now to see how far his arrogance would stretch. "I do not understand, Aaron," I said softly. "Why do I need to sign over the cabin? The mortgage has been paid off for 20 years. Tax liabilities." Aaron lied flawlessly. He did not even blink, his eyes locked onto mine with predatory intensity. "The property taxes have skyrocketed this quarter. You are on a fixed income, Dad. You cannot afford the upkeep, and the financial liability is bleeding over into the logistics firm assets. I need to absorb the property into my corporate portfolio right now to shield you from the financial blowback. Just sign the paper, and you can still visit it on weekends, when we allow it." Natalie crossed her arms, leaning against the marble counter, her eyes rolling in exaggerated impatience. "Aaron is trying to protect you, James. A man of your advanced age has no business owning isolated property anyway. You should not even be driving alone anymore. Look at you. You are a mess. We are tired of cleaning up after your mistakes and managing your decline." I stared at the signature line on the heavy legal paper. They needed my signature desperately. The tracking module on my truck was meant to end my life on that mountain, but perhaps the hitman required immediate payment. Or perhaps whatever dangerous people Aaron was associating with were breathing down his neck for cash. He needed liquid assets, and he needed them yesterday. The lakeside cabin was valuable collateral. If I was dead at the bottom of a ravine, the property went to him immediately through the estate. Since I was standing in his kitchen breathing and taking up space, he had to take it from me while I was still alive. I looked up from the papers. I met Aaron gaze directly. I let the tired, confused old man act slip just a fraction of an inch, allowing a sliver of absolute ice to enter my voice. "No," I said softly. "I am not signing the cabin over to you." The silence in the kitchen became absolute. The ambient noise of the rain hammering against the glass windows seemed to vanish entirely. Aaron's face contorted. The mask of the concerned, pragmatic son dissolved completely, replaced by a vicious, raw hostility that twisted his features. He slammed his hand flat on the marble island with such force that the wine glasses violently rattled. "You do not have a choice anymore, old man," Aaron hissed. He leaned over the counter until his face was inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive alcohol and desperate panic. "You are a liability. You are confused, you are erratic, and you are a danger to yourself. You sign that deed tonight. If you refuse tomorrow morning, Natalie and I are going straight to a judge. We will have you declared medically unfit. We will take full power of attorney. We will sell the cabin ourselves, and we will lock you in an assisted living facility where you cannot hurt anyone or ruin my business. You sign it right now, or you lose everything. Choose." As Aaron shouted his threats, his cell phone lit up on the marble counter. A notification blinked on the screen. It was not a standard text message alert. The light pulsed in a rapid, specific sequence of 3 short bursts, followed by a long red flash. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was the exact encrypted frequency signature I had seen blinking on the military-grade tracking module I had ripped out of my truck dashboard an hour ago. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The hitman was updating him on the failed job. My own son had orchestrated my execution. My refusal hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The word no seemed to echo against the cold glass windows, drowning out the relentless drumming of the storm outside. Aaron stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the muscles in his jaw rigid. He was not used to hearing that word from the man he had already mentally buried. Before he could recover his composure, Natalie stepped out from behind the marble island. She walked toward me with the slow, predatory grace of a cornered viper. She crossed her arms, the fabric of her silk blouse whispering in the quiet room, and tilted her head, looking at me not with anger, but with a weaponized, suffocating pity. "James," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, patronizing whisper that made my stomach turn. "Listen to yourself. Look at yourself. You are standing in our kitchen, soaking wet, shivering, completely disoriented. You do not even realize how much you are declining, do you?" Her words were meticulously chosen, designed to strip away my dignity layer by layer. She took a step closer, waving a manicured hand toward the stack of legal papers. "Your memory is failing," she said. "You are confusing basic facts. Just last week you forgot our dinner plans, and now you are driving alone up a dangerous mountain road in the middle of a torrential downpour. A man of your advanced age has absolutely no business operating a heavy vehicle, let alone managing a remote piece of real estate." I kept my expression vacant, letting my eyes drift slightly out of focus, feeding her narrative. She fed on it instantly. She turned to Aaron, casting him a look of manufactured sorrow, then turned back to me. "We have been talking to a specialist," she continued smoothly, slipping the blade in deeper. "A wonderful doctor who specializes in geriatric transition. There are facilities, James. Beautiful, secure places with round-the-clock care. Assisted living is your only logical future. You cannot survive on your own anymore, and we simply cannot bear the burden of wondering if you are lying dead in a ditch somewhere because you forgot how to find your way home." I remained completely silent. I let her words wash over me, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her insult. I watched them exchange a glance of mutual triumph, fully believing their own fabricated reality. They looked at my faded canvas jacket, my calloused hands, and my quiet demeanor, and they saw a broke dependent pensioner who had simply overstayed his welcome on this earth. They saw an obsolete old man holding on to a worthless cabin out of stubborn sentimentality. They did not know the truth. They did not know the man standing in front of them. As I stared at their smug, entitled faces, my mind drifted back 40 years to a time before the luxury townhouses, before the imported Persian rugs, before the expensive wine. They did not know what it meant to be truly desperate. I survived on the bitter, freezing streets of Chicago when I was 15 years old, sleeping under cardboard and fighting for scraps behind industrial kitchens. I did not inherit a comfortable life. I carved it out of stone. I built the regional logistics firm that funded their lavish lifestyle from a single rusted delivery van. I drove 20-hour shifts, hauled freight, until my hands bled, and negotiated contracts with men who would just as soon slit your throat as shake your hand. I built an empire with my own sweat, my own blood, and my own relentless will to survive. 5 years ago, I was tired. I wanted to enjoy the peace of the lake. I wanted to honor Martha and her memory in the quiet woods. So I handed Aaron the keys to the kingdom. I gave him the title of Chief Executive Officer. I gave him the corner office, the 6-figure salary, and the illusion of absolute control. I wanted to see if the boy I raised could become a man. I wanted to give him the world. But I was not a fool. You do not survive the streets by giving away your armor. When I stepped down from the daily operations, I quietly and meticulously structured a blind holding company. It was an invisible legal fortress that owned every truck, every warehouse, and every corporate contract. I retained ultimate, untouchable veto power over the entire enterprise. Aaron thought he was the king, but he was merely a highly paid manager operating entirely at my unseen discretion. I had the power to liquidate his entire reality with a single phone call to my attorney. I watched them sip their $200 wine, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet belonged entirely to the man they were trying to lock in a psychiatric ward. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Aaron finally broke his gaze away from me. He was agitated, practically vibrating with a nervous, destructive energy. He turned his back to me and leaned heavily against the marble counter, snatching his smartphone from the surface. His thumbs flew across the glass screen, texting someone furiously. He was frantic, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was demanding answers. He was trying to figure out why the old man was standing in his kitchen instead of bleeding out at the bottom of Dead Man Curve. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my guise of senile confusion, my eyes fixed harmlessly on the counter space next to him. Then it happened. Aaron set the phone face down on the white marble. The room was dim, lit only by the under-cabinet lighting. In the shadowed reflection of the polished stone, I saw the notification light on the top edge of his device illuminate. It was a faint, piercing red light. It blinked. 3 rapid, sharp flashes. A pause of exactly 1 second. Then a long, sustained red glow. Then 3 rapid flashes again. My breathing stopped. The sound of the rain outside faded into absolute nothingness. The world narrowed down to that single pulsing red light. 3 short bursts, a long flash, 3 short bursts. It was not a standard text message notification. It was not an email alert. I knew that specific encrypted sequence. The image of the black military-grade tracking module I had ripped out of my dashboard less than an hour ago flashed violently in my mind. I had stared at that identical red light in the darkness of the abandoned gas station, watching it pulse in the exact same rhythmic encrypted signature. It was a closed-loop frequency, a direct communication tether between the hunter and the handler. The realization hit me with the kinetic force of a freight train. It was not a physical blow, but a massive internal detonation that shattered the very foundation of my universe. The air was suddenly sucked from my lungs. My vision tunneled. Aaron did not just know about the hit. Aaron was the handler, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had handed an empire had contracted a faceless assassin to drive a massive logging truck into my driver's side door. He had planted a military tracker in my vehicle. He had watched my digital marker crawl up the mountain road, waiting with bated breath for the blip to vanish off the cliff. He had ordered my execution. I looked at the back of his head, watching the tense line of his shoulders as he poured himself another glass of wine with a shaking hand. He was frustrated. He was angry that his father was still breathing. Natalie stood beside him, her arms still crossed, wearing a look of annoyed superiority, completely unaware of the lethal digital tether sitting on the counter between them. The grief of losing a son is a profound, paralyzing agony. But in that kitchen, staring at the flashing red light of his treachery, The grief evaporated before it could even take root. It was instantly incinerated by a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. The man I raised was dead. The creature standing in front of me was a parasite, a predator who had decided my life was the only thing standing between him and absolute wealth. He thought I was a fragile target. He thought I was a casualty waiting to happen. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a man who had survived the darkest corners of the world. He had no idea that the silent, shaking old man standing in his hallway was meticulously calculating the precise coordinates of his total destruction. The tremble in my left hand was no longer an act. It was the physical manifestation of my restraint holding back the violent urge to cross the room and wrap my hands around his throat. But I knew better. Violence was quick, and violence was messy. I was going to dismantle him piece by piece, asset by asset, until he had absolutely nothing left but the terrifying realization of what he had awakened. I blinked heavily, forcing my shoulders to slump even further, hiding the lethal focus in my eyes. I let out a ragged, trembling sigh, playing the part of the broken elder flawlessly. I needed him comfortable. I needed him arrogant. I needed him to believe that his backup plan would work so I could use it to bury him alive. The red light on the marble counter pulsed with a rhythmic, mocking certainty. 3 short flashes. A long, solid glow. 3 short flashes. It was the digital heartbeat of my own assassination playing out right in front of me. Every instinct forged in the brutal alleys of my youth screamed at me to close the distance to grab the heavy crystal wine decanter and smash it across the arrogant face of the boy I had raised. The betrayal was a living, breathing thing, in the room, sucking the oxygen from my lungs. I could feel the violent heat of adrenaline flooding my veins, urging me to scream, to demand answers, to wrap my calloused hands around his throat until he confessed. But survival is a cold discipline. Erupting into violence would only give them the excuse they needed. If I attacked Aaron, I would be the deranged, violent old man they were already claiming I was. They would call the police. They would have me sedated, restrained, and locked away in a psychiatric ward before the sun came up. The military-grade tracking module at the bottom of the ravine would rust into nothingness, and the ghost funds in my accounts would be drained. Aaron would win. I swallowed the burning rage. I forced it down into the darkest, deepest pit of my stomach and locked the door. I did not scream. I did not step forward. I embraced a profound, absolute silence. I dropped my gaze to the floor, staring blankly at the muddy puddles forming around my boots. I let my shoulders sag, completely releasing the rigid tension in my spine. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, like a man whose lungs were failing him. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my left hand to rub my temple, and I let my fingers tremble. It was a subtle, meticulous tremor. Not an exaggerated, theatrical shake, but the pathetic, involuntary vibration of a nervous system breaking down under stress. "I am so tired," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. I let my words slur just a fraction, blurring the edges of my consonants. The rain. I could not see the road, Aaron. Everything was just so dark. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, but my peripheral vision caught the immediate shift in their posture. The frantic, paranoid energy that had gripped Aaron just moments before simply evaporated. He looked at his shaking, soaking wet father, and his panic dissolved into profound, overwhelming contempt. He did not see a threat. He saw a nuisance. He saw a broken machine ready for the scrapyard. "Look at him." Natalie scoffed, crossing her arms tightly across her silk blouse. She did not even bother to lower her voice. "He is completely lost, Aaron. He does not even know what day it is. You are letting a senile man dictate our financial future." I let my head bob slightly, as if I could not track the conversation. I took a clumsy, shuffling step backward, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support. The tremor in my hand transferred to my arm. I clutched the fabric of my soaked jacket, pulling it tight around my chest, as if I were freezing to death. Deep in my right pocket, my fingers wrapped around the tiny, sharp edges of the extracted SIM card. The plastic bit into my skin, grounding me, keeping the lethal focus in my mind razor-sharp while my body played the fool. "I just need to lie down," I mumbled, blinking rapidly as if fighting off confusion. My head is pounding. "I do not understand these papers tonight, Aaron. I cannot read them. The letters are swimming. Just let me sleep. We can look at the taxes tomorrow." Aaron scoffed a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He picked up his phone, the red notification light still pulsing, and shoved it into his pocket carelessly. His arrogance blinded him completely. Because I was giving him the exact version of reality he desperately wanted to believe, he accepted it without a single second of hesitation. He wanted a weak, dying father, so he saw a weak, dying father. "Fine," Aaron snapped, snatching the heavy stack of legal documents off the marble island and shoving them back into his leather briefcase. "We will do this tomorrow morning, but you are not leaving this house until those papers are signed. Do you understand me? You are done driving. You are done living alone. You are signing the cabin over, and then we are taking you to the clinic." I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes downcast. "Yes, Aaron. Whatever you think is best. I just need to sleep." "Get out of my kitchen," Natalie hissed, waving her manicured hand as if shooing away a stray dog. "You are dripping everywhere. Go to the guest room and stay there. Do not wander around the house in the middle of the night. I swear, if I find you confused in the hallway again, I am calling the facility tonight." I did not answer her. I simply turned, shuffling my feet awkwardly against the hardwood floors, dragging my muddy boots as I made my way down the long, dimly lit corridor toward the guest bedroom. Every step was a calculated performance. I hunched my back, favoring my right side, letting my breath wheeze through my teeth. But beneath the pathetic exterior, my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I reached the guest room and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The space was pristine, sterile, and completely devoid of comfort. It felt like a holding cell. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me. I reached out and turned the brass lock. The quiet click of the mechanism was the only sound in the room. I stood in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the storm outside. The tremor in my left hand instantly vanished. My shoulders straightened. My breathing slowed, returning to a deep, controlled rhythm. I stood to my full height, the fragile old man evaporating into the shadows. I reached into my soaking wet jacket and pulled out the tiny SIM card, holding it up in the faint light filtering through the window blinds. This tiny piece of silicone was the only physical proof I had that my son had orchestrated a professional hit on my life. The reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was locked in a guest room inside the house of my would-be murderers. The logging truck had failed. Aaron knew it had failed. The red light on his phone was the assassin confirming the missed target, which meant Aaron was running out of time. The violent underground lenders he owed money to were not going to wait gracefully while he navigated probate court. They needed their $3 million immediately. If Aaron realized the accident was not a mistake, if he suspected for a single second that I had found the tracker and understood his plan, he would not wait for a judge to declare me incompetent. He would walk into this guest room tonight and smother me with a pillow. He would claim my heart finally gave out from the stress of the storm. Natalie would cry for the paramedics, and they would have my body cremated before the ink on my death certificate was dry. I was trapped behind enemy lines. I could not sleep. I could not even take off my wet clothes. I had to remain vigilant, ready to fight for my life if the door handle began to turn. But waiting was a losing game. I needed to go on the offensive. I needed to trace the origin of the encrypted signal on this SIM card. I needed to know exactly who Aaron had hired and exactly how deep his debts went. But I could not use my own phone. Aaron paid the family plan cell phone bills. He had access to the data logs. If I called anyone, he would see the number. I could not use the house Wi-Fi. He probably monitored the network traffic. I was entirely cut off from my usual resources. I walked quietly toward the large guest room window, peering through the wooden blinds at the rain-swept street below. I needed an ally. I needed someone with the technical expertise to crack military-grade encryption and the ruthless cunning to navigate the criminal underworld without asking moral questions. More importantly, I needed someone completely invisible to Aaron, someone my son did not even know existed. My mind sifted through decades of business contacts, street hustlers, and corporate fixers I had employed during the early brutal years of building my logistics empire. Most of them were dead, retired, or compromised. But there was one name that surfaced from the depths of my memory. A ghost from a life I had buried a long time ago. Decades ago, before the wealth and the boardrooms, I had quietly funded the education and early career of a brilliant, incredibly vicious kid from the South Side. He was a survivor, just like me. He did not operate in the light. He operated in the deep shadows of corporate espionage and aggressive litigation. He owed me everything, and he operated entirely off the grid. Oh, I squeezed the SIM card tightly in my palm. I knew what I had to do. I had to survive the night in this house pretending to be a sleeping, senile old man. And before the sun came up, before Aaron could summon his corrupt notary or push his psychiatric evaluation, I had to slip out into the storm and unleash a ghost upon his entire world. The silent reckoning had begun. The digital clock on the bedside table read 4 a.m. when I finally moved. I had not slept a single second. I sat in the suffocating darkness of the guest room, listening to the house settle, listening to the steady breathing of my son down the hall. The man who wanted me dead was sleeping soundly, believing his problems were solved. I stood up, my joints aching from the damp cold that had seeped into my bones, but the tremor in my hand was gone. It was replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. I slipped out of the room, keeping my footsteps light, pressing my weight against the edges of the floorboards where the wood would not creak. I bypassed the kitchen, completely ignored my muddy boots sitting by the front door, and let myself out through the side patio. The storm had broken, leaving behind a freezing, dense fog that clung to the city streets. I walked 3 blocks in the freezing mist until I reached my truck. When I turned the ignition, the rumble of the engine felt like the first breath of a new life. I drove straight into the heart of the financial district. The steel and glass towers pierced the fog like jagged teeth. I pulled up to the curb outside the towering headquarters of Cross & Associates. The lobby was empty, save for a single night guard who recognized my face and immediately unlocked the private elevator. He did not ask questions. You do not ask questions when someone is heading to the top floor before dawn. The elevator shot upward, carrying me toward the only man in this city capable of dismantling my son. Vincent Cross was not just a corporate attorney. He was an apex predator in a tailored suit. Decades ago, before my logistics empire had a name, I found a brilliant, desperate kid scrubbing warehouse floors to pay off his father's gambling debts. I knew what that desperation tasted like. I had lived it. I silently created a blind scholarship that pulled Vincent out of the gutter, paid his way through the most ruthless law school in the country, and armed him with the teeth he needed to tear his enemies apart. He never forgot where that money came from. He owed his entire existence to me, and he operated with a terrifying absolute loyalty. I bypassed the pristine reception desk and walked straight into his corner office. Vincent was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He did not look surprised to see me. He took one look at my soaked clothes, my hollow eyes, and the mud caked on my jeans. He set his coffee down and walked behind his massive mahogany desk. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the tiny extracted SIM card, and dropped it onto the polished wood. It hit the surface with a faint plastic click. My son hired a contractor to run me off the mountain pass, I said, my voice rough and hollow in the quiet room. A logging truck blew through a blind curve. It was a perfectly timed blindside intercept. They installed a military-grade tracker behind my dashboard. Aaron is the handler. Vincent did not gasp. He did not offer hollow words of comfort or useless apologies. He picked up the SIM card between his thumb and forefinger, inspecting the gold circuitry. His eyes darkened, turning into cold obsidian. He did not ask if I was sure. He knew I would not be standing in his office at 5 in the morning if there was a margin for error. "We cannot involve the police," I told him, keeping my voice completely steady. "If Aaron sees a badge, he will panic. He will initiate his backup plan to have me committed, and he will liquidate my accounts to pay off whatever massive debt is driving this desperation. I need to know exactly who programmed this tracker. I need to know who was sitting on the other end of the frequency." Vincent nodded. He pulled open his desk drawer, retrieved a heavy encrypted laptop, and plugged a specialized card reader into the port. He slid the SIM card into the reader. "The police are bound by warrants and red tape, James," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard with brutal efficiency. "My people are not. I pay a team of independent security contractors, a very large retainer, to bypass the law entirely. If this tracker pinged a cell tower anywhere in the tri-state area, they will find the digital footprint." We stood in silence as the decryption software ran. The tension in the room was absolute. Every second that ticked by was another second Aaron had to realize the hit had failed and scramble his defenses. I watched the progress bar crawl across Vincent's screen, my mind replaying the moment the massive truck tore through the guardrail. I needed a name. I needed a face. 20 agonizing minutes later, the laptop emitted a sharp metallic chime. Vincent leaned forward, his eyes scanning the cascading lines of data illuminating the screen. He hit a final keystroke, and a high-resolution satellite map snapped into focus on the monitor. A pulsing red dot glowed angrily in the center of the industrial district. "We have a ghost," Vincent murmured, tracing the coordinates with his pen. The SIM card was routed through a proxy server, but my guys broke the bounce. The signal originates from an underground freelance tech who operates under the handle Leo. He runs a black market server farm out of an abandoned meatpacking warehouse on the edge of the river. He is the one who programmed the comms. He is the one who was tracking your truck. I stared at the red dot on the screen. The man who had charted my execution was sitting less than 5 miles away. But the conflict was not resolved. It had mutated. The voice on the radio had warned me. The tracker was meant to kill me, but the man monitoring the frequency had saved my life. Why? Why would a hired tech betray his own contractor in the final 3 minutes of a hit? "I need to look this Leo in the eye," I said, turning toward the office door. "I need to know why he hijacked his own assassination plot." Vincent slammed his laptop shut and grabbed his heavy wool overcoat from the back of his chair. He did not call his security team to handle it. He did not delegate. When it came to my life, Vincent dealt in blood. "We are going together," he said, his voice laced with quiet menace. We took Vincent's armored sedan, blending into the early morning commuter traffic. The city was waking up ignorant to the violent undercurrent pulling us toward the river. The industrial district was a sprawling, decaying graveyard of rusted steel and shattered concrete. We navigated the pothole-ridden streets, pulling into a narrow alleyway behind a massive windowless brick building that smelled faintly of old iron and river sludge. The rain had started again, a fine mist that coated everything in a slick, greasy sheen. There were no cars parked outside, no signs of life. But a thick, heavy power cable ran illegally from a city junction box directly into a boarded-up ventilation shaft on the side of the building. Leo was in there pulling massive amounts of electricity to run his servers. We stepped out of the car. Vincent reached into his coat and produced a heavy steel pry bar. He did not bother looking for a key or a hidden switch. He approached the heavy reinforced steel door at the back of the loading dock, wedged the pry bar into the rusted locking mechanism, and threw his entire weight against the steel. The metal groaned and snapped with a violent screeching crack. The heavy door swung open, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black space filled with the overwhelming, deafening hum of high-capacity cooling fans. We stepped into the darkness, walking past rows of towering server racks that blinked with thousands of tiny green and blue lights. The air was freezing, completely temperature-controlled to keep the machines from melting down. At the far end of the warehouse, sitting behind a massive glowing bank of computer monitors, was a thin, pale man in a hooded sweatshirt. He was frantically typing, completely absorbed in the glowing screens, oblivious to our breach, until the heavy steel door slammed shut behind us, echoing like a cannon blast. Leo spun around his chair, squeaking violently against the concrete floor. His eyes widened in sheer absolute panic as he saw us emerging from the shadows of his server farm. He scrambled backward, tripping over a tangle of heavy power cords, crashing hard onto the floor. I did not give him a second to breathe. I did not give him a chance to run. I closed the distance in 3 massive strides, grabbing him by the collar of his sweatshirt and hauling him violently to his feet. I slammed his back against the vibrating steel of a server rack, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Vincent stepped up right beside me, his presence radiating pure, lethal intent. Leo gasped for air, his eyes darting frantically between us. "You tracked my truck," I said, my voice a low, terrifying whisper that cut straight through the roar of the cooling fans. "You routed the hit, but you warned me to keep driving straight. You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me why you betrayed my son before I let my attorney show you what a real accident looks like." The warehouse was freezing, the air dominated by the aggressive, deafening roar of hundreds of cooling fans. I did not give Leo a second to breathe. I did not give him a chance to process the reality that the dead man he had been monitoring was now standing inside his fortress. I closed the distance in 3 massive strides, grabbing him by the thick collar of his hooded sweatshirt and hauling him violently to his feet. I slammed his back against the vibrating steel frame of a server rack. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. Vincent stepped up right beside me. He did not say a word, but his presence radiated a pure, lethal intent that instantly broke whatever bravado the young hacker possessed. Leo's eyes darted frantically between us, his face pale and slick with stale sweat. "You tracked my truck," I said. My voice was a low, terrifying whisper that cut straight through the mechanical roar of the room. "You routed the hit. You guided that logging truck to the blind curve, but you warned me to keep driving straight. You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me why you betrayed your employer before I let my attorney show you what a real accident looks like." Leo scrambled his hands desperately, clawing at my wrists. He was young, smelling of cheap energy drinks and raw panic. He looked at Vincent, whose face remained an impassive mask of stone, and realized instantly that we were not police officers bound by warrants or jurisdiction. We were men who operated outside the boundaries of the law. "Please, man, please." Leo choked out, his voice cracking with terror. "I did not want to do it. I swear. Your son is crazy. He is completely out of his mind." I shoved him harder against the metal grid. The sharp edge of the rack dug into his spine. 5 seconds, I whispered, leaning in closer. He stiffed me, Leo cried out, throwing his hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender. He stiffed me on the payment. I eased my grip just a fraction, letting him drop back down to the soles of his shoes, though I kept my fists firmly twisted in his collar. "Explain," I demanded. Leo swallowed hard, his chest heaving. "Aaron came to me 3 weeks ago. He had this military surplus tracker. He said he needed it hardwired into your dashboard, bypassing the standard diagnostic ports so it would never show up on a routine mechanic scan. He told me to set up an encrypted relay, an open communications channel, so the driver in the logging truck could time his approach perfectly based on your exact GPS coordinates. I did the job. I spliced it in while your truck was parked at the firm during a scheduled oil change. But when it came time to pay up, Aaron laughed in my face. The sheer petty nature of the betrayal hung heavily in the cold air of the warehouse. My son, the acting chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar logistics company, was haggling over the price of his own father's assassination. He promised me $50,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency. Leo continued, his words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. But he only transferred 5. When I told him I would lock down the server, he threatened to call immigration on my family. He told me I was garbage. He said I was a nobody, and that if I ever breathed a word of this to anyone, he would have the same guys in that logging truck come pay me a visit. He treated me like a rat. Leo looked down at the concrete floor, his shame mixing with a sudden vicious pride. So I kept a back door open in the code. I watched the digital marker of your truck moving up the mountain pass tonight. I saw the secondary marker, the logging truck moving into the intercept position at the curve. Aaron was messaging me every 30 seconds, demanding updates, demanding to know if it was done. He was so arrogant, so smug. I wanted to take his prize away from him. I hacked the audio relay in your dashboard and broadcast the warning over your radio. I did not care if you lived or died, man. I just wanted to see Aaron lose. I released my grip on his sweatshirt, taking a slow step back. The absurdity of my survival washed over me. I had not been saved by divine intervention or a brilliant tactical maneuver. I had been saved by the wounded ego of an underpaid computer hacker. It was pathetic, and it was deeply terrifying. "Show me," I commanded, pointing toward the massive glowing bank of computer monitors on his desk. "Show me everything you have on him." Leo did not argue. He scurried over to his ergonomic chair, dropping into it and dragging his keyboard across the desk. His fingers flew across the keys, bringing up cascades of encrypted code. He bypassed 3 separate firewalls in a matter of seconds. "If he is treating people like this, it means he is desperate," Leo muttered, his eyes scanning the data scrolling rapidly across the screens. "People with money do not stiff their technicians. They pay them to stay quiet." Aaron did not have the cash. Leo hit a final keystroke, and a complex financial ledger materialized on the largest monitor. It was a comprehensive digital map of the operational accounts for my logistics firm. The company I had built from a single rusted delivery van, driving 20-hour shifts until my hands bled carefully, counting every single penny to secure a future for my family. I leaned over Leo's shoulder, staring at the numbers. It was a massacre. Aaron had not just been mismanaging the company, he had been bleeding it dry. He had established a labyrinth of dummy corporations and shell vendors routing massive monthly payments out of the primary operational fund for non-existent freight maintenance and ghost shipments. I traced the outgoing lines with my finger, my heart turning into a cold block of lead. $3 million. In the last 18 months, my son had embezzled $3 million of liquid capital from the business that was supposed to secure our legacy. "Where did it go?" I asked, my voice devoid of all emotion. Leo highlighted a series of destination accounts. "These are offshore crypto wallets, but the endpoints are heavily monitored by federal task forces. This is cartel money, Mr. Bennett. Your son is in bed with a syndicate of underground street lenders, the kind of men who operate out of chop shops and illegal casinos." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, forming a picture so ugly I could barely comprehend it. Aaron had always possessed a weakness for the high life and insatiable appetite to prove he was smarter and wealthier than everyone in the room. He had bypassed the slow, steady grind of the logistics business and taken the company capital straight to the underground tables. He had placed catastrophic illegal bets, and he had lost. $3 million was not an investment. It was a desperate attempt to cover his losses. And it had not been enough. Leo pulled up an intercepted archive of Aaron's text messages. The screen filled with brutal, violent threats directed at my son. The lenders did not care about his corporate title. They did not care about his glass-paneled townhouse. They wanted their money, and they were promising to take it out of his flesh if he failed to deliver. "He is drowning," I realized, staring at the desperate messages my son had sent back to the syndicate, pleading for more time. "Exactly," Leo said, swiveling his chair to face me. He begged them for a 1-week extension. He told them he had a guaranteed $5 million payout coming in before the end of the month. My life insurance policy. I had taken it out decades ago to ensure Martha and Aaron would never end up back on the streets if my heart gave out during a long-haul drive. Aaron was the sole beneficiary. $5 million tax-free upon my accidental death. It was the perfect solution to his massive, lethal debt. He would pay off the street lenders, walk away with $2 million in profit, and I would be nothing but a tragic memory at the bottom of a mountain ravine. But the hit had failed. I had driven past the curve. The logging truck was a burning wreck, and I was standing in a freezing server farm staring at my son's digital death warrant. Leo clicked on the most recent message in the archive received just 20 minutes ago. The text was short, stripped of all the previous posturing and empty threats. It was a final absolute ultimatum from the syndicate. We saw the news about the truck crash. We know your old man is still breathing. You are out of time, Aaron. $3 million in cash by Friday or we start taking pieces of your wife. Today was Wednesday. Aaron had exactly 48 hours to produce $3 million in liquid capital, or the violent men he had climbed into bed with would tear his world apart. Vincent stepped forward, his heavy wool coat brushing against the server racks. He looked at the ultimatum on the screen, and then turned to me. He is trapped, James. He cannot trigger the insurance policy now. You are fully alert, and the hitmen are exposed. He has no liquid assets, and the lenders are moving in. What is his next move? A cold, dark certainty settled over me. I knew exactly what Aaron would do. A cornered animal does not lie down and accept death. It strikes wildly with whatever weapons it has left. If he could not kill me in a tragic accident to claim the insurance, he would have to find a way to legally seize the company assets he had not yet drained. He would have to take everything I owned while I was still breathing. The threat he made in the kitchen echoed clearly in my mind. He was going to have me declared medically unfit. He was going to drag me in front of a judge, claim I was suffering from severe, irreversible dementia, and seize immediate power of attorney. Once he had the legal right to sign my name, he could liquidate the holding company, drain the offshore reserves, and hand the cash over to the mob while I was locked away in a state-run asylum, unable to speak for myself. The warehouse was freezing cold. The air smelled of ozone and damp concrete. I stood behind Leo and watched the glowing monitors. The young hacker was terrified. His hands shook as they hovered over the mechanical keyboard. I told him to dig deeper into the archives. I needed to see every single message Aaron had sent since the truck missed me. Leo typed rapidly, bypassing layers of security. He pulled up a hidden partition on the server. The screen filled with lines of text messages. They were encrypted communications between Aaron and Natalie. The timestamps showed they were sending these messages while I was standing in their kitchen. They were texting each other while I was dripping water onto their imported rug. I leaned closer to the bright screens. The glare illuminated the dust floating in the cold air. I read the messages and felt my blood turn to absolute ice. The truck accident was only the first option. It was meant to be a clean and highly profitable solution. But Aaron always planned for failure. He never left his survival to chance. Since I walked through his front door alive, he immediately pivoted to his backup plan. He told Natalie to activate the second phase. I watched the text scroll down the screen. They were not panicked about my survival. They were simply annoyed. They mocked my wet clothes and my trembling hands. They joked about how easy it would be to convince a judge that my mind was completely gone. Leo opened a secure file attachment hidden within the chat log. A scanned document appeared on the center monitor. It bore the official crest of a private psychiatric clinic. The clinic was located just outside the city limits in a remote wooded area. A doctor's name sat at the top of the page in bold black letters. I did not recognize the name. I read the diagnostic summary printed below. It was an absolute work of fiction, meticulously crafted to destroy my life. The doctor claimed he had evaluated me extensively over the past 6 weeks. He wrote detailed notes about severe paranoia and aggressive outbursts that never happened. He fabricated stories about me wandering into traffic and forgetting my own name. He stated my cognitive decline was rapid and completely irreversible. The final diagnosis was late-stage dementia. The bottom of the page held a certified signature and a heavy red medical stamp. It was a legally binding death sentence for my independence. Vincent stepped forward and looked at the name on the document. His face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. He told me the doctor was a known mercenary. The man was a disgraced physician who operated in the shadows of the medical community. He specialized in writing fraudulent competency evaluations for wealthy families. Greedy heirs paid him massive sums of money to declare their elderly parents insane. It was a fast and brutal way to seize control of family fortunes. Aaron had purchased a medical executioner. The chat logs revealed the true cost of this betrayal in precise digital receipts. Aaron had wired $20,000 to the corrupt doctor earlier that afternoon. He paid the bribe hours before the logging truck ever crossed my path on the mountain. Aaron had secured my psychological imprisonment as an insurance policy. If the assassin missed the mark, the doctor would finish the job. My son was prepared to erase my mind if he could not destroy my body. He had negotiated the price of my sanity over a casual text message chain. Natalie had even replied with a smiling emoji when the wire transfer cleared the doctor's account. They celebrated the destruction of my freedom while I was driving through the rain, completely unaware of their plotting. Leo opened another folder containing drafted legal petitions. The paperwork was flawless and terrifying. Aaron had prepared an emergency request for absolute power of attorney. The petition used the fake medical diagnosis as undeniable proof that I was a danger to myself. The document demanded immediate legal guardianship over all my personal wealth and corporate holdings. Aaron planned to submit this paperwork to a judge the moment the courts opened this morning. The process would be swift and merciless. I would be stripped of all my human rights. I would become a legal ward of the state, completely dependent on the son who was actively trying to murder me. The horror deepened as I read the final document in the folder. It was an intake transfer form for a state-run asylum. It was not a comfortable assisted living facility or a high-end retirement home. It was a bleak, concrete institution designed to hide the forgotten members of society. It was a place where patients were stripped of their identities. They were heavily sedated and strapped to narrow beds in overcrowded wards. Aaron intended to lock me behind thick steel doors with no access to a telephone or a lawyer. He intended to pump my veins full of chemical restraints so I could never speak the truth to anyone. He wanted me trapped in a permanent, drug-induced fog staring at a blank wall until I died from neglect. He would control my entire empire while I rotted in a locked room. The sheer vicious cruelty of his backup plan was far worse than a violent car crash. A car crash was a quick death. The asylum was a slow, deliberate erasure of my soul orchestrated by the boy I had raised. I stepped back from the glowing computer screens. The warehouse fans roared around me, but the sound felt distant. My chest tightened as the gravity of the betrayal settled over me. Aaron was a sociopath. He felt no guilt and no hesitation. He viewed my existence as a simple logistical problem that required a brutal solution. He had planned every angle of my demise with the same cold efficiency he used to manage corporate spreadsheets. Vincent turned to me. His voice was low and urgent. He told me we had less than 3 hours before the courthouse opened its doors. We had to secure an immediate injunction. We needed to wake up a legitimate neurologist and get a real competency evaluation on record before Aaron could present his fake documents. Vincent began formulating a complex legal defense. He listed the judges we could call before dawn. He mapped out a strategy to freeze the probate courts. We were preparing for a prolonged and bitter legal war over my autonomy, but the legal strategy was suddenly shattered. A violent vibration erupted against my chest. The sudden buzzing cut through my intense focus. It did not come from the server racks. It came from the deep interior pocket of my wet canvas jacket. I reached inside and pulled out my secondary mobile device. It was a heavily encrypted phone completely isolated from the family cellular plan. I kept this device strictly for critical alerts regarding the blind holding company. The screen lit up in the dark warehouse. It cast a pale blue glow across my face. I stared at the automated message on the screen. It was a maximum priority fraud alert from my primary corporate banking institution. The text flashed in bright white against the black background. The numbers on the display did not make sense to my tired mind at first. I counted the zeros twice. Then the terrifying reality crashed down on me. Aaron was not waiting for the sun to come up. He was not waiting for the courthouse to open or the power of attorney to be approved by a judge. The street lenders were demanding their money immediately, and Aaron was completely out of time. He was bypassing the entire legal system. He was moving in the digital shadows while the city slept. The alert stated that a massive emergency wire transfer had just been initiated. $3 million was actively moving out of my primary operational reserve account. This was the spine of my logistics company. Aaron had somehow circumvented the blind holding company firewalls. He had bypassed the dual authentication protocols I had set up years ago. He had forged my digital authorization credentials and replicated my electronic signature. He was forcing the money through the international banking gateways right now, while I stood frozen in the warehouse. He was liquidating my life savings. He planned to pay off the violent mobsters before dawn. He would secure his own safety with my money, and he would still use the fake medical evaluation to lock me in the asylum so I could never report the theft. He would leave me penniless and trapped in a padded room while he walked away completely clean. The tension in the warehouse spiked to a fever pitch. The digital numbers on my phone screen pulsed ominously. The money was moving through the clearinghouse servers. If the wire transfer cleared the international protocols, the cash would vanish into untraceable offshore accounts forever. My corporate empire would suffer a catastrophic, fatal blow. The logistics firm I spent 40 years building would collapse under the financial strain. The funds I needed to fight back and dismantle his life would be gone in a matter of minutes. I looked at Vincent. The legal maneuvers were completely useless now. We were no longer fighting a slow courtroom battle over medical documents. The war had escalated into an immediate, active digital heist. The wealth I had bled for was slipping through my fingers, and my own son was pulling the trigger from his pristine townhouse. I squeezed the phone until the plastic casing groaned under the pressure. The silence of my grief was gone entirely. It was replaced by a singular, burning imperative. It was time to stop the transfer and burn his world to ash. The blue glow of my phone screen illuminated the freezing warehouse. $3 million was actively bleeding out of my primary operational reserve. Vincent saw the digits flashing. His eyes narrowed. He did not hesitate. He reached into his wool overcoat and pulled out his secure satellite phone. He was already dialing the private emergency number for the president of the clearinghouse bank. He was preparing to freeze the routing protocols and lock down the entire financial grid. I moved faster. I reached out and clamped my hand down hard on his wrist. My grip was like a vice locking his arm in place before the call could connect. He looked up at me, his expression shifting from aggressive focus to total confusion. I shook my head slowly, keeping my voice completely hollow and steady. I told him not to stop the transfer. I told him to let it run. Vincent stared at me as if the freezing air had damaged my mind. He looked from my calloused hand holding his wrist back to the glowing screen where my life's work was currently being hijacked. He told me I was out of my mind. He told me that if the funds cleared the international gateway, the money would be completely unrecoverable. The mob would have their cash, and Aaron would walk away without a single scratch on his pristine, tailored suit. I tightened my grip on his arm, forcing him to lower the phone. I explained that if he blocked that transfer right now, Aaron would immediately receive a failed transaction alert. The cold logic of survival settled over me, pushing aside the blind rage. I told Vincent to think about what a cornered animal does when the trap snaps shut. Aaron knows the hitman missed me on the mountain. He knows he has exactly 48 hours to pay back a violent underground syndicate before they start dismantling his life piece by piece. If he sees that $3 million wire get rejected, he will panic. A terrified, desperate man does not sit quietly and rethink his life choices. He escalates. If he realizes the money is blocked, he will call the assassins again. He will send them to the house. Or worse, he will simply walk down the hallway to the guest room where he thinks I am sleeping, and he will finish the job himself with his own bare hands. I let go of Vincent. I looked back at the terrified hacker sitting silently in his rolling chair. Leo was watching us, his eyes wide, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the violence we were casually discussing. He knew he was sitting in the crossfire of a war that was rapidly escalating beyond simple corporate theft. I told Vincent we had to feed his arrogance. I turned back to the glowing monitors. Aaron thinks he is the smartest man in every room he enters. He believes he has perfectly executed a masterstroke of digital theft. He thinks the old man is snoring in the guest bed while he steals the kingdom right out from under him. We are going to let him believe exactly that. We are going to let him taste the victory. It is the only way to keep him docile while we dig the grave he is going to fall into. I ordered Leo to step away from the primary terminal. The hacker scrambled out of his chair, retreating into the shadows of the cooling fans. Vincent took his place. He cracked his knuckles and cracked his neck, settling into the heavy leather chair. He pulled up the secure remote access portal, linking directly into my blind holding company. Decades ago, I had paid Vincent to build a legal fortress so complex and so deeply buried in corporate obscurity that no auditor and no greedy heir could ever pierce its walls. Now I was calling in the artillery. I commanded him to open the master architecture. I told him to activate the absolute veto protocols. Vincent typed furiously. Lines of dense legal code and asset management structures filled the massive screens. The digital representation of my entire life was laid out before us. Every heavy-duty transport truck, every regional distribution warehouse, every commercial shipping contract, and every offshore reserve account was tethered to a single invisible spine. I was the sole signatory. Aaron held the title of Chief Executive Officer, but he only possessed the keys to the rooms I allowed him to enter. He never knew about the basement. He never knew about the foundation. I stood behind Vincent, watching the cursor blink against the dark background. I told him to cut the arteries. I ordered him to detach the logistics firm from my personal estate entirely. Vincent did not pause to question the command. He executed the digital commands with the ruthless precision of a surgeon amputating a diseased limb. In a matter of minutes, he systematically severed the legal tethers connecting my name to the multi-million-dollar transport empire. The fleet of trucks was transferred. The commercial real estate holdings were detached. The highly profitable government shipping contracts were reassigned. I watched my net worth plummet on the screen as the assets were completely drained from my personal portfolio. We were wiping the slate clean, leaving nothing but dust and echoes for my son to inherit. But we did not just dissolve the company. That would trigger standard corporate alarms. We had to bury it where Aaron could never reach it. I instructed Vincent to shift everything into the irrevocable charitable foundation. The foundation had been established years ago in honor of Martha. It was designed to fund community development programs in the impoverished neighborhoods where I had fought to survive as a teenager. Until this moment, it had only held a fraction of my wealth. Now it was about to swallow an empire. Vincent initiated the massive transfer protocols. The legal documents were drafted and filed digitally, binding the assets into a trust that was absolutely impenetrable. An irrevocable trust could not be challenged in probate court. It could not be seized by a power of attorney. It could not be liquidated by a desperate son trying to pay off violent street lenders. The moment Vincent hit the final execution key, the logistics firm officially ceased to belong to James Bennett. It belonged to the ether. It belonged to the memory of my late wife. I pointed to the monitor displaying Aaron and his unauthorized $3 million wire transfer. I told Vincent we now had to address the bleeding operational account. The transaction was still cycling through the initial clearinghouse algorithms. It had not yet breached the international gateways. Aaron was sitting in his luxury townhouse watching a progress bar slowly creeping across his laptop screen. He was holding his breath, waiting for the confirmation that would save his miserable life. Vincent pulled up the back-end routing codes for the compromised account. He noted that if we drain the operational fund completely, the wire will bounce immediately. He warned me that Aaron would get an insufficient funds error within 60 seconds. I leaned over the desk, my reflection catching in the dark glass of the monitor. I told him not to drain it completely. I told him to leave a ghost in the machine. I ordered him to leave exactly enough digital collateral in the operational reserve to satisfy the initial automated bank checks. We needed to make the system believe the money was there. We needed to let the transfer status remain in a perpetual state of processing. Vincent's fingers danced across the keyboard. He manipulated the internal ledger, establishing a temporary phantom balance. He erected a digital mirage. On Aaron's screen, the progress bar would continue to spin slowly and predictably. It would say, pending authorization. Aaron would stare at those words, and he would exhale. He would lean back in his expensive leather chair and take a slow, triumphant sip of his $200 wine. He would believe that the vast sum of stolen money was navigating the complex web of global finance, making its way to the mobsters' offshore wallets. He would believe he was a genius who had outsmarted death and outsmarted his father. But the reality of his situation was a nightmare he could not even begin to comprehend. Vincent finished the coding and initiated a hard freeze on the actual physical funds. The $3 million was locked down in a holding pattern, suspended halfway between my bank and the syndicate's untraceable accounts. Then Vincent executed the final devastating maneuver. He anonymously flagged the destination routing numbers directly to the federal tax authorities. He tripped a silent high-priority alert within the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The trap was set, and it was flawless. Aaron had forged my signature to authorize a massive international wire transfer to a known cartel money laundering destination. He had committed severe federal wire fraud. And because we had frozen the funds in a processing state, the federal algorithms were now locking onto his digital footprint. They were tracing the IP address of his laptop directly back to his secure townhouse router. He thought he was paying off a debt, but he had just handed his own head to the federal government on a silver platter. I stepped back from the monitors, the freezing air of the warehouse filling my lungs. The roaring, cooling fans sounded like a distant chorus. I looked at the red notification light still blinking harmlessly on my phone. Aaron believed he had won. He believed his power of attorney paperwork would be stamped by a judge in a few hours. He believed he would lock me in a bleak state, run asylum, and throw away the key. He believed he was the architect of his own brilliant survival. But the ground beneath his feet was completely gone. He was standing on thin air. He had no company. He had no inheritance. He had no $3 million to save his skin from the violent men he owed. He had nothing but a frozen computer screen and a massive federal indictment waiting for him at the sunrise. I had not laid a single finger on him. I had not raised my voice. I had simply stepped into the darkness and let him dig his own grave with his own unbridled greed. The silent reckoning was moving into its final deadly phase. I turned my back on the glowing screens and walked toward the heavy steel door. I needed to get back to the townhouse before dawn. I needed to crawl back into that guest bed and play the role of the broken old man one last time while I watched his entire universe burn to the ground. The roaring of the cooling fans in the warehouse felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Vincent and I stood perfectly still, watching the final keystrokes lock down the $3 million transfer. The money was trapped in a digital purgatory, but the war was far from over. I looked down at Leo. The young hacker was shivering, his pale hands hovering above the mechanical keyboard. He looked like a cornered rat waiting for the final blow. I tapped the heavy steel desk with my knuckles, bringing his terrified eyes up to meet mine. I told him we were not finished. I demanded to know how Aaron had bought himself the 48-hour extension. Violent underground street lenders do not grant grace periods based on verbal promises. They demand blood or they demand collateral. I told Leo to dig back into the encrypted archives and find out exactly what my son had offered the syndicate to hold them off while he waited for my assassination. Leo swallowed hard and turned back to his monitors. His fingers moved frantically, pulling up hidden directories and scanning through the dense layers of Aaron correspondence with the mob fixers. The green code reflected in his wide, panicked eyes. He bypassed another firewall and opened a secured Dropbox linked to Aaron's personal device. A high-resolution scan of a legal document materialized on the center screen. My breath caught in my throat. It was not a corporate asset. It was the physical deed to the lakeside cabin. I stared at the black and white image of the property lines and the official county seal. The cabin was not just a piece of real estate. It was the very soul of my late wife, Martha. I had laid those pine logs with my own 2 hands decades ago. I had built it as a sanctuary for our family, far away from the noise and the brutal grind of the city. It was the only place left on this earth that still held her memory intact. And Aaron had casually handed it over to a cartel of violent thugs. Leo opened the attached messages, explaining the terms of the terrible deal. Aaron had used his position as my designated corporate proxy to pledge the physical deed to the syndicate as a bridge guarantee. The mobsters accepted the cabin as collateral to appease their bosses until my $5 million life insurance policy paid out. If the insurance money did not arrive by Friday, the syndicate would legally seize the property and sell it through their dark money channels to recoup their losses. Aaron had wagered the last sacred piece of his mother's legacy on a fatal car crash. The sheer absolute depravity of his actions burned away whatever lingering traces of paternal mercy I had left. Vincent leaned over the desk, his sharp eyes analyzing the forged signatures and the temporary lien recorded in the digital files. He told me the syndicate was smart. They had filed a quiet provisional claim on the deed through a corrupt county clerk. If we did not neutralize that claim immediately, the mob would legally own the land the second Aaron defaulted on Friday. Vincent began outlining a strategy to tie the property up in civil litigation. He suggested we file an emergency fraud dispute to freeze the deed in civil court, keeping it out of the hands of the lenders for years. I shook my head. A slow courtroom battle was not enough. I did not want to protect the property for myself. I wanted to turn the collateral into vapor. I wanted the syndicate to realize they had been played for fools by a desperate liar. I turned to Vincent and ordered him to execute a nuclear legal maneuver. I told him I wanted to permanently, irrevocably donate the entire lakeside property to the State Department of Natural Resources. Vincent stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He looked at me with absolute disbelief. He warned me that an irrevocable donation to the state meant I would lose the cabin forever. I could never reclaim it. I could never sell it. The land would be absorbed into the public trust as a protected nature conservancy. The state government would possess immediate untouchable sovereignty over every single blade of grass and every pine log I had ever built. I did not blink. I told him to do it. The cabin was meant to be a sanctuary, and letting it fall into the hands of bloodthirsty criminals would be a desecration of everything Martha stood for. Giving it back to the earth, protecting it forever from development or seizure, was the only way to truly honor her memory. More importantly, an immediate state acquisition would instantly annihilate the syndicate's physical collateral. A gang of underground street lenders cannot foreclose on a federally protected state park. They cannot bully or intimidate the Department of Natural Resources. The asset would simply cease to exist in the private sector. Vincent recognized the absolute finality in my voice. He did not waste another second. He pulled his heavy encrypted laptop from his leather bag and set it down next to Leo monitors. He accessed the secure digital portal for the state property registry. As a high-level corporate attorney, he possessed priority filing credentials that allowed him to bypass the standard bureaucratic delays. The keys clicked rapidly as he drafted the emergency transfer of deed. He attached my verified digital signature, executing my ultimate veto power over the asset. He classified the transaction as an immediate philanthropic grant to the State Conservation Authority. The transfer required zero processing time. State governments never hesitate to accept free, valuable land. I watched the progress bar on Vincent's screen fill with a solid, definitive green line. The system generated an official state-stamped confirmation receipt. The lakeside cabin was officially public property. The deed was gone. The collateral was vaporized. I turned back to Leo. The young hacker was staring at the confirmation receipt with a look of pure, terrified awe. He realized he was sitting in the presence of a man who was dismantling a financial empire with the flick of a wrist. I ordered Leo to monitor the syndicate's digital activity. I needed to know if they were actively tracking the collateral. Leo's hands flew across his keyboard, tapping into the automated scraping bots the mob used to monitor public property records. The syndicate did not trust anyone. They employed sophisticated algorithms to constantly check the county registries, ensuring their extortion targets did not attempt to sell or transfer assets behind their backs. The moment Vincent filed the state donation, the county registry updated its public database. We waited in the freezing hum of the server room. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, a violent red cascade of warning alerts flooded Leo's left monitor. The syndicate's automated bots had detected the massive structural change in the property deed. The system registered that the collateral attached to Aaron's $3 million debt had been permanently transferred to the state government. The temporary lien the mob had quietly filed was instantly invalidated. Leo swallowed audibly, his throat clicking in the quiet room. He opened the intercepted communication channels linking the underground lenders. The chat logs exploded into chaotic, furious activity. The fixers managing Aaron's debt were screaming at each other through the encrypted texts. They realized the physical asset guaranteeing their money had just vanished into thin air. They checked the status of the $3 million wire transfer Aaron had initiated and saw it was hopelessly trapped in a federal holding pattern flagged for severe tax fraud. The realization swept through the syndicate network like a shockwave. Aaron had failed to execute the hit. Aaron had failed to wire the cash. And now Aaron had somehow lost the physical collateral he promised them. To the violent men running the underground ledgers, it looked exactly like my son was orchestrating a massive, elaborate scam to steal their money and leave them holding empty promises. Leo read the final intercepted message aloud, his voice shaking uncontrollably. The regional boss of the syndicate had just issued a direct command to his enforcers. The text did not demand answers. It did not ask for a meeting or an explanation. It was a cold, absolute directive to find Aaron immediately and bring him in breathing or otherwise. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. My son had spent the entire night believing he was the master architect of my destruction. He thought he had outsmarted his father, outsmarted the law, and outmaneuvered the criminal underworld. He was sitting in his luxury townhouse right now drinking expensive wine and waiting for his problems to disappear. He had no idea that the digital ground beneath his feet had completely evaporated. I looked at the glowing screens watching the digital hunt begin. The street lenders were mobilizing. They were tracking Aaron's phone. They were sending men to his corporate office. They would be sending heavily armed enforcers to his pristine glass townhouse before the morning commute even started. I had stripped him of every single shield he possessed. Vincent closed his laptop and slid it back into his leather bag. The ruthless attorney looked at me with a grim, silent understanding. The legal maneuvers were finished. The financial devastation was absolute. The only thing left to do was survive the immediate physical fallout. I turned away from the terrified hacker and walked toward the broken steel door of the warehouse. The freezing rain was still falling outside, mixing with the dense early morning fog. I had to get back to the townhouse. I had to slip back through the side patio and crawl into that cold guest bed. I had to resume the pathetic, trembling role of the broken old man one last time. Because when the men from the syndicate kicked down the mahogany front door to collect their pound of flesh from my son, I wanted a front row seat to the absolute terror in his eyes. The silent reckoning was complete. The execution had begun. I turned back toward the glowing monitors before reaching the heavy steel door of the warehouse. A sudden frantic clicking from the mechanical keyboard drew my immediate attention. Leo was staring at a secondary screen, his pale face illuminated by a harsh, sterile white light. He told Vincent to look at the new data stream cascading across the monitor. The young hacker had continued digging through the encrypted text archives while we were executing the wire trap. He had uncovered a completely hidden chain of communications buried deep within a separate proxy server. These were direct, heavily encrypted messages between Aaron and the primary enforcer of the underground street syndicate. I walked slowly back to the desk, the freezing air of the warehouse chilling the damp fabric of my heavy canvas coat. I demanded to know exactly what Leo had found. The young hacker pointed a shaking finger at a digital copy of a highly complex legal contract. It was a provisional deed of trust. I stared at the property address listed at the very top of the document. The address belonged to the lakeside cabin. It was the sanctuary I had built for my wife Martha decades ago. The betrayal deepened, settling into my bones like a crushing physical weight. Aaron had not just promised the mob my life insurance money. The violent street lenders had demanded immediate physical collateral to grant him his 48-hour extension. Aaron had pledged the cabin to appease them until the assassination was complete. The sheer arrogant audacity of his manipulation became terrifyingly clear. He had placed those exact transfer documents on the marble kitchen island earlier tonight, demanding my immediate signature. He had told me it was to protect me from rising property taxes, but he had already leveraged the land entirely. He had handed the deed over to hardened criminals as a guarantee for his own massive gambling debts. He desperately needed my signature to finalize a transfer that was already in motion behind my back. He was perfectly willing to hand over the only physical memory of his mother to a cartel of violent thugs just to save his own skin. I closed my eyes and let the profound memory of the cabin wash over me. I remembered hauling the heavy raw pine logs up the dirt road long before the surrounding area was ever developed. I remembered the smell of the fresh wood, the damp earth, and the sound of Martha laughing as we painted the window frames in the summer sun. It was the only place in the world where her gentle spirit still felt entirely tangible. Aaron knew exactly what that piece of land meant to me. He grew up running through those woods learning to fish on that lake, and he had casually placed it on a subterranean poker table to save his own miserable life. The crushing grief gave way to a cold, calculated, and absolute determination. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Vincent. I told him the syndicate was not getting the land. I told him we were going to sever the collateral right now. Vincent analyzed the provisional lien on the screen. He told me the mob had quietly filed a temporary claim through a highly corrupt clerk at the county registry. If Aaron defaulted on Friday morning, the syndicate would legally absorb the property and sell it through their dark money channels. They were actively monitoring the county database every single hour to ensure the asset remained frozen in their favor. I told Vincent I wanted to execute my ultimate veto power over the blind family trust holding the deed. I instructed him to permanently and irrevocably donate the entire lakeside property to the State Department of Natural Resources. Vincent nodded, his expression grim and completely focused. He understood the brutal brilliance of the maneuver immediately. The state government operates an aggressive nature conservancy program. They absorb private land and convert it into protected wilderness sanctuaries. Once the state takes absolute possession, the land becomes entirely untouchable by any private creditors. A gang of underground street thugs cannot foreclose on a federally protected state park. They cannot send armed enforcers to intimidate the Department of Natural Resources. The physical collateral would simply vanish into thin air, evaporating into the public domain forever. Vincent opened the secure digital portal for the State Land Registry. He used his high-level corporate credentials to bypass the standard bureaucratic waiting periods. His fingers moved with brutal efficiency, typing up the emergency transfer documents. He authorized the immediate philanthropic grant, stripping the cabin and the surrounding acres completely out of our private family trust. He applied my encrypted digital signature to the final execution order. We watched the loading bar slowly fill the screen. The system processed the irrevocable donation. A bright green confirmation receipt illuminated the monitor. The transaction was complete. The lakeside cabin officially belonged to the earth and the state. It would be protected forever in Martha honor. The collateral was gone. I turned my attention back to Leo. I told the hacker to monitor the syndicate automated scraping bots. The mob used highly sophisticated algorithms to constantly check the public property records. They wanted to make absolutely sure their extortion targets did not try to sell or transfer assets behind their backs. The county registry had just updated its global database. The algorithm was bound to catch the massive structural change to the deed. We waited in the deafening mechanical hum of the server farm. The freezing air stung my lungs. 3 agonizing minutes passed in absolute silence. Then a violent cascade of flashing warning alerts flooded the screens. The scraping algorithms had detected the transfer. The temporary lien the mob had filed was instantly rejected and completely invalidated by the state government acquisition. The digital alarm bells within the syndicate network began ringing with chaotic intensity. Leo pulled up the intercepted communication channels. The secure chat rooms used by the mob fixers exploded with frantic, angry messages. The men managing Aaron's massive debt realized the physical asset guaranteeing their money had just evaporated into nothingness. They frantically checked the status of the $3 million wire transfer. They saw the funds were still trapped in a perpetual processing state flagged by the federal tax authorities for severe fraud. The reality of the situation hit the underground lenders like a massive shockwave. Aaron had failed to execute the assassination. Aaron had failed to wire the liquid cash. And now Aaron had somehow miraculously lost the physical collateral he had sworn was completely secure. To the violent men running the street syndicate, it looked exactly like my son was orchestrating a massive, elaborate scam. They believed he was trying to steal their money and leave them holding empty promises. A debtor who cannot pay is a liability. A debtor who tries to actively defraud the mob is a dead man. Leo read the newest intercepted messages aloud, his voice shaking uncontrollably. The regional boss of the syndicate had just issued a direct, absolute command to his enforcement team. The message did not ask for a meeting. It did not offer a new deadline or demand a frantic explanation. It simply provided Aaron's current location at the luxury townhouse and ordered the enforcers to bring him in immediately. The order explicitly stated they did not care if he was breathing when they found him. The hunt had officially begun. My son had spent the entire night wrapped in a blanket of supreme toxic arrogance. He believed his backup plan was flawless. He thought he would wake up, have me committed to a bleak state-run asylum, and assume total control of my entire corporate empire. He believed he was the brilliant architect of my destruction. He had no idea that he had just become the most wanted man in the city. The street lenders were mobilizing heavily armed teams. They were tracking his cell phone signal. They were driving toward his pristine glass townhouse right now. I had stripped him of his corporate wealth. I had frozen his stolen cash. I had vaporized his physical collateral. And I had done it all without laying a single violent finger on him. The trap was absolutely perfect. I told Vincent our work at the warehouse was complete. I thanked Leo for his inadvertent loyalty and promised Vincent would handle his relocation safely. I turned my back on the glowing monitors and walked toward the broken steel door. The freezing rain had stopped, but the dense morning fog still clung to the industrial streets. Dawn was slowly breaking, casting a pale gray light across the silent city skyline. I got back into my truck. I navigated the empty streets, feeling a profound, terrifying peace settling over my mind. The grief of losing my son was entirely gone, replaced by the cold satisfaction of restoring the natural order. I parked 3 blocks away from the luxury townhouse and walked through the freezing mist. I slipped through the side patio door, moving silently across the dark hardwood floors. I ignored the expensive Persian rugs and the flawless marble counters. I walked down the long hallway and entered the guest bedroom. The house was completely silent. Aaron and Natalie were still asleep upstairs, dreaming of their impending wealth and my impending imprisonment. I took off my damp canvas jacket and laid down on the guest bed. I pulled the heavy blankets up to my chin. I resumed the posture of a frail, broken old man waiting for the sun to rise. The digital and legal warfare was over. Now I just had to wait for the wolves to arrive at the front door. The Zenith was the kind of restaurant that floated above the city like a glass fortress. It was a temple of extreme wealth, where the air felt thick with exclusivity and the lighting was carefully designed to make every patron look like royalty. I stepped out of the elevator on the top floor, wearing the faded gray suit I had bought a decade ago for a funeral. The fabric was worn at the elbows, and the lapels lacked the sharp, modern cut of the men standing in the lobby. The hostess looked at me with a perfectly practiced mask of polite disdain. She asked if I was lost. I told her my name and watched her perfectly manicured fingers tap a sleek tablet. She guided me through the sprawling dining room. The space was filled with the low murmur of expensive negotiations and the clinking of crystal glasses. Every table was an island of power. I walked past them feeling the heavy stares of the elite, judging my frayed cuffs and scuffed leather shoes. I did not let my gaze drop to the floor. I kept my back completely straight and my face entirely blank. Aaron had chosen a large circular booth situated directly in the center of the main dining floor. It was a highly visible location completely exposed to the neighboring tables. This was not a private family meeting. It was a theatrical performance designed for an audience. I saw my son sitting there in a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my first delivery van. Natalie sat beside him, wearing a pristine white dress that radiated a cold, sterile elegance. Across from them sat a man I immediately recognized from the digital files Leo had pulled from the encrypted servers. It was the mercenary psychiatrist. He wore an expensive gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of fabricated academic authority. He looked like a man who was very used to being paid massive sums of money to destroy the lives of the elderly. I approached the table and stood silently for a moment. Aaron looked up and immediately deployed a look of exaggerated tragic pity. He stood up slowly and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, guiding me into the booth as if I were a fragile piece of glass about to shatter. He spoke loudly enough for the couple at the adjacent table to hear every single word. "Dad, you made it," Aaron said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "We were getting so worried about you wandering around the city by yourself. We thought you might have forgotten the address again." I had never forgotten an address in my entire life, but I simply sat down and smoothed the napkin over my lap. I did not defend myself. I let him build his stage. Natalie leaned across the table and reached for my hand. I pulled it back, letting it rest on the heavy white tablecloth. Her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered her composure. Aaron gestured to this man sitting across from me. "Dad." "This is Dr. Evans," Aaron said, projecting his voice even louder. "He is a specialist. We brought him here because we are just so deeply concerned about your memory lapses and your aggressive episodes. We want to make sure you get the best medical care possible before you accidentally hurt yourself." Dr. Evans leaned forward and offered a grave, sympathetic nod. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me with the practiced eyes of a paid executioner. "It is a pleasure to meet you, James," the doctor said in a soft, measured tone. "Aaron and Natalie have told me everything about your recent struggles. I am here to help you navigate this difficult transition." Before I could respond, a waiter appeared in a crisp uniform holding a silver tray. He asked for our orders. I opened my mouth to speak, but Aaron immediately cut me off. He raised his hand and gave the waiter a knowing, apologetic look. "My father will just have the plain oatmeal and some warm water," Aaron declared loudly. "He has a lot of trouble chewing solid foods lately, and we do not want to upset his stomach." The waiter nodded sympathetically and walked away. I stared at Aaron. I had eaten a steak the size of my hand 2 nights ago, but I remained absolutely silent. The surrounding patrons were now subtly casting glances in our direction. They saw a successful, wealthy son taking compassionate care of his severely degraded father. The narrative was taking root exactly as Aaron intended. Natalie sighed dramatically and rested her head on Aaron's shoulder. "It is just so hard watching his mind deteriorate like this," she said, her voice carrying a theatrical tremor. "Yesterday, he did not even recognize me when I walked into the room. He thought I was a stranger breaking into the house." The doctor pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket and jotted down a quick note. He was formally documenting their lies in real time, building the medical foundation for my imprisonment. This behavior is unfortunately very common in the advanced stages of cognitive decline, the doctor said loudly. Paranoia and loss of facial recognition are clear indicators that James can no longer live independently without 24-hour supervision. The psychological torture continued as the waiter returned with our food. Aaron cut his expensive imported steak, while I stared at a bowl of gray, tasteless oatmeal. They spoke about me in the third person, as if I were a deaf-mute animal sitting in a cage. They discussed nursing facilities and full-time caregivers, tossing around exorbitant figures that they claimed they would happily pay out of their own pockets. They talked about how I had left the gas stove burning all night last week, and how I had wandered into the street in my pajamas. None of it was true. It was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. They were building a fortress of public sympathy while secretly preparing to drain my life savings and lock me in a concrete cell. I picked up my spoon and slowly stirred the oatmeal. I focused on the mechanical motion to keep the burning rage from showing on my face. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to reach across the table and drag Aaron out of his chair. I wanted to shatter his smug, confident mask and expose the desperate, thieving coward hiding underneath. But a sudden, violent outburst was exactly what they were waiting for. They needed me to lose my temper so the doctor could document a severe psychotic episode. Silence was my only armor. I looked closely at Aaron as he took a sip of his wine. He was playing the confident son perfectly, but I could see the tiny cracks in his armor. I noticed a thin sheen of sweat collecting at his hairline. I saw the way his fingers tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against his thigh under the table. He was putting on a magnificent show. But beneath the tailored suit, he was a man suffocating in sheer terror. He knew the street lenders were hunting him. He knew his timeline was collapsing. Every second that ticked by brought the violent syndicate closer to his doorstep. He was desperately rushing this performance because he needed my signature to save his own life. The dinner slowly came to an end. The plates were cleared away, leaving nothing but the pristine white tablecloth between us. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a low, distant hum. The casual, theatrical chatter suddenly evaporated. Aaron shifted his posture. His shoulders squared and his eyes lost the fake, sympathetic warmth. He looked at Natalie, and she gave him a short, definitive nod. The time for acting was over. It was time to spring the trap. Aaron reached down and lifted a thick, heavy leather portfolio from the floor. He placed it directly in the center of the table. He unzipped the portfolio and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Emergency medical power of attorney and total asset transfer." Aaron slid the stack of papers across the smooth white fabric. The heavy documents stopped exactly 1 inch away from my hands. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew an expensive gold-plated fountain pen. He laid the pen gently on top of the papers. The reflection of the crystal chandeliers caught the gold surface of the pen, making it shine like a deadly weapon in the center of the table. Aaron leaned in close. His voice dropped the theatrical volume. He spoke in a low, cold whisper meant only for me. "Sign this, Dad," he commanded. "It is for your own safety. We are going to take care of everything from now on. You do not have to worry about the logistics firm or the bank accounts anymore. Just put your name on the dotted line and you can finally rest." Dr. Evans adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, offering his professional seal of approval. "James, this really is the most responsible choice you can make," the doctor said, in a smooth, reassuring tone. "Your cognitive tests are deeply concerning. If you do not sign this voluntarily, the state will have to intervene and the process will be much more traumatic for everyone involved. Aaron and Natalie are offering you a peaceful, dignified transition. You need to trust them." I looked at the doctor and then I looked at Natalie. She was staring at the pen with hungry, desperate eyes. She was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for me to surrender my entire empire with a few strokes of ink. Finally, I looked at Aaron. I saw the absolute terror hiding just behind his arrogant glare. He needed this signature to survive. He needed my money to pay off the street lenders before they tore his life apart. The entire warehouse revelation echoed in my mind. I knew the logistics firm was already gone. I knew the offshore accounts were locked in a federal trap. I knew the lakeside cabin was a protected state park. I knew Aaron was a dead man walking. But right now, in this exact second, he believed he held my life in the palm of his hand. He believed I was a broken, confused old man who had no choice but to submit to his authority. The heavy gold pen sat on top of the white paper waiting to be lifted. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like gravity pressing down on my shoulders. I stared at the pen. I let the silence stretch out until the seconds felt like hours. Aaron held his breath. Natalie gripped the edge of the table. I did not move a single muscle. I just stared at the instrument of my surrender and waited for the perfect moment to drop the sky on their heads. The tremor in my right hand was a calculated performance I had perfected over the past 12 hours. It was a physical manifestation of the exact weakness they so desperately wanted to see. I watched Aaron closely as his eyes tracked the slight shaking of my fingers. He genuinely thought he was watching the final fading embers of a dying man. He truly believed the heavy gold pen resting on the white tablecloth was the final nail in my coffin. He sat there, radiating a toxic, suffocating arrogance, waiting for me to surrender my entire life with a single signature. I closed my eyes for one single second. When I opened them, the performance was completely over. I pulled my hand back from the edge of the table and placed it flat against the smooth fabric. The trembling stopped instantly. The fragile hunch in my shoulders vanished as if it had never existed. I straightened my spine, pressing my back against the leather booth with a rigid, commanding authority. I felt the decades of calloused labor and ruthless corporate warfare return to my blood, flooding my veins with absolute clarity. I was no longer the confused old man wandering the streets in their fabricated medical horror story. I was the architect of an empire, and I was looking directly at a thief. The sudden physical transformation was impossible for them to ignore. The smug, confident mask on Aaron's face cracked right down the middle. His eyes darted to my perfectly steady hands and then snapped up to my face. The terrified realization began to dawn on him. He saw the absolute razor-sharp focus in my gaze. There was no dementia. There was no paranoia. There was only the cold execution of a trap he had blindly walked into. Natalie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, pulling her hands into her lap. She glanced at the psychiatrist, seeking some sort of immediate medical explanation for my sudden, frightening lucidity. Dr. Evans adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another patronizing medical observation, but I did not give him the chance. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or cause a scene. The true application of ultimate power requires absolute silence. I reached inside the inner pocket of my faded gray suit jacket. Aaron leaned forward slightly, expecting me to pull out my reading glasses. He expected me to put them on and sign his fraudulent documents like an obedient prisoner. Instead, my fingers wrapped around the cold metal of a sleek black digital audio recorder. I pulled the device from my jacket and set it down precisely in the center of the table. I pushed it right next to the heavy gold pen and the stack of fake medical evaluations. The black metal contrasted sharply against the pristine white linen. Aaron stared at the device. The color began to drain rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his face the shade of dirty chalk. Natalie let out a short, nervous breath. Dr. Evans looked at the machine as if it were an active explosive device. I reached out with a perfectly steady finger and pressed the play button. A sharp electronic beep cut through the low ambient hum of the luxury restaurant. Then the clear, unmistakable voices of my son and his wife filled the quiet space of our circular booth. The recording was a flawless compilation of the encrypted audio files Leo had pulled from their compromised server just hours ago. The first voice belonged to Aaron. He was yelling in a panicked, frantic tone. He was screaming at Natalie about the logging truck on the mountain pass. The audio was crystal clear. Aaron cursed the hired assassin for missing the blind curve. He explicitly detailed how he had paid the underground syndicate to orchestrate the fatal crash to secure a clean assassination. He complained bitterly that I had survived and ruined his entire timeline. He stated loudly on the recording that he needed the $5 million life insurance payout immediately to cover his massive illegal gambling debts. I watched Aaron as his own voice condemned him. He stopped breathing entirely. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Natalie clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She looked around the restaurant, terrified that the neighboring tables were listening to her husband confess to attempted murder. The audio continued playing relentlessly, without a single pause. The recording shifted to their secondary conversation. It was the exact discussion they had while I was standing soaking wet in their kitchen. Natalie's voice echoed from the small black speaker. She laughed cruelly and called me a pathetic burden. She suggested they accelerate the medical execution because she was tired of looking at me. Then Aaron's voice returned, detailing the massive embezzlement. He openly admitted to draining $3 million from the logistics firm operational accounts. He outlined the dummy corporations and the shell vendors he had used to steal my money over the past 18 months. But the final piece of the recording was the most devastating for the third person sitting at our table. The audio captured Aaron arranging the bribe. He spoke clearly about transferring $20,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency to a mercenary psychiatrist. He explicitly named Dr. Evans. He laughed on the recording about how easy it was to purchase a fraudulent medical diagnosis of severe dementia from a corrupt doctor. Dr. Evans went completely rigid. The remaining blood vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He stared at the audio recorder in pure disbelief. His entire lucrative career of destroying elderly patients for profit was completely over. The evidence was irrefutable, and it was playing out loud in the middle of the most exclusive restaurant in the city. He slowly pushed his chair back from the table, his eyes darting toward the exit. He was preparing to run, to escape the nightmare unfolding in front of him. Aaron could not run. He was completely trapped in the center of the cage he had built. He realized his entire life was collapsing in real time. The arrogant chief executive officer was gone. The sophisticated, wealthy son was gone. All that remained was a cornered, desperate animal. The panic completely consumed him. The facade of the compassionate caretaker shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged violently across the table. He ignored the crystal glasses and the expensive silverware, knocking them aside. He threw his entire body weight forward, reaching out with clawed hands to smash the audio recorder. He wanted to destroy the machine and shatter the digital evidence. He desperately needed to silence his own voice, but his hands never touched the black metal. Before Aaron could reach the center of the table, a massive shadow fell over the booth. A heavy hand clamped down on the back of Aaron's neck with the force of an industrial vice. The grip hauled my son backward, lifting him out of his lunge and slamming him violently back into his leather chair. The impact rattled the table and sent the gold pen spinning onto the floor. I looked up. Vincent stepped smoothly out of the deep shadows of the adjacent booth. He had been sitting there the entire time, blending perfectly into the dim lighting of the restaurant. His tailored wool coat draped over his broad shoulders as he loomed over my son. His face was an absolute mask of stone. He did not let go of Aaron's neck. He kept him pinned securely to the chair, pressing him down with unyielding physical authority. But Vincent was not alone. Two men stepped out of the shadows right behind him. They wore sharp, dark suits and carried themselves with a rigid professional authority that completely dwarfed the superficial power of the restaurant patrons. They moved with absolute tactical precision, blocking any possible route of escape for Aaron or Natalie or the doctor. They were plainclothes federal agents. Vincent had pulled every string in his extensive legal arsenal to bring them here. They belonged to a specialized federal task force dedicated to severe wire fraud and the financial exploitation of the elderly. They had been sitting in the booth directly behind Aaron for the entire hour. They had listened to his entire patronizing performance. They had watched him slide the fraudulent power of attorney documents across the table in an attempt to steal my remaining assets. And they had just heard the crystal-clear audio recording of his sweeping criminal enterprise, including attempted murder and federal wire fraud. The lead agent stepped forward. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clink of the cuffs sounded louder than any noise in the dining room. He looked down at Aaron with a cold, practiced efficiency. Aaron was gasping for air, his chest heaving under Vincent's heavy grip. He looked at the federal agents, and then he looked at me. The terror in his eyes was absolute. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to play a game of shadows with a man who had built an empire in the dark. He had mistaken my silence for weakness, and it had cost him his absolute ruin. I reached out and calmly pressed the stop button on the audio recorder. The heavy hand of the plainclothes federal agent forced Aaron back down into his leather seat. My son collapsed with a dull thud, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling around his shoulders. The ambient noise of the luxury restaurant seemed to evaporate completely, leaving our circular booth isolated in a vacuum of sheer tension. I reached across the pristine white tablecloth and pressed the stop button on the digital audio recorder. The sudden silence that followed the recording of their murderous plot was heavier than the concrete floor of the warehouse. I kept my posture absolutely rigid and my voice completely flat. I told Aaron we needed to meticulously deconstruct the timeline of his ruin. I told him he had built his entire criminal enterprise on a foundation of absolute vapor. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded gray jacket and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper. I slid it across the table, letting it come to rest directly on top of his fraudulent power of attorney petition. I instructed him to read the date stamped at the top of the page. It was an official cancellation notice from my primary insurance provider. I told him I had completely liquidated the $5 million life insurance policy over 3 weeks ago. The massive payout he had promised the underground syndicate simply did not exist. He had wagered his life and my death on a ghost. Aaron stared at the document. His face lost all remaining color, turning the shade of dirty ash. His jaw worked silently, but his throat was too dry to form the words. He swallowed hard and shook his head, attempting to rally a pathetic shred of his former arrogance. He whispered that the insurance did not matter. He claimed he was still the chief executive officer, and he still controlled the logistics empire. He stated he could liquidate the commercial fleets and the shipping contracts to pay his debts. Vincent stepped forward from the shadows of the adjacent booth. He placed a thick blue-bound legal dossier squarely in front of my son. I told Aaron to read the title. It was the Irrevocable Charitable Trust. I explained that while he was sleeping in his townhouse, I had used my ultimate veto power to sever every single corporate artery connecting my name to the business. The fleet, the warehouses, the offshore reserves, and the government contracts were completely gone. They were permanently buried within a philanthropic foundation dedicated to the memory of his mother. I told him the company assets were legally untouchable by any probate court or any desperate heir. He possessed nothing but an empty title. Natalie suddenly slammed her palms against the table, rattling the expensive crystal glasses. She leaned forward, her face twisted into a mask of frantic desperation. She screamed that they still had the property. She yelled that Aaron had already transferred the physical deed to the lakeside cabin. She claimed the street lenders held the land as collateral, and the syndicate would accept the property in exchange for their lives. She glared at me with a vicious, panicked triumph, believing they had outsmarted me with a piece of dirt. I withdrew the final document from my coat. It bore the bright, heavy green seal of the state government. I slid the state conservancy deed over the table until it rested against her trembling fingers. I told her the cabin belonged to the state. My voice was as cold as the winter ice on that lake. I explained that Vincent had executed a permanent philanthropic grant to the Department of Natural Resources hours ago. The state government had assumed immediate absolute sovereignty over the land. I told them the physical collateral they were relying on had vanished into the public domain. A gang of street thugs cannot foreclose on a protected state park. The collateral was entirely worthless. Natalie stared at this green seal as her lower lip began to tremble. She realized they had handed a violent cartel a completely fraudulent guarantee. Aaron let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He looked at the federal agents standing silently behind his chair and then turned his terrified eyes back to me. He whispered that he had the $3 million from the morning wire transfer. He claimed the money had already processed, and he could still pay the fixers. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. I told him the $3 million was trapped in a digital cage. I explained that we had configured the operational account to display a phantom balance. I told him the money he attempted to withdraw this morning was frozen halfway between the clearinghouse and the offshore cartel wallets. And then I delivered the final, absolute blow. I told him that initiating an unauthorized $3 million international wire transfer to a known money laundering destination had automatically triggered a high-priority felony alert within the Internal Revenue Service. I gestured to the two men standing behind him. I told Aaron these agents specialized in federal wire fraud and elder abuse. He had committed a massive federal crime from the IP address of his own laptop. He had invited his own execution. Dr. Evans finally broke his paralyzed silence. The corrupt psychiatrist scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He threw his hands up and babbled incoherently, claiming he was just a medical consultant who had nothing to do with their financial crimes. He begged the agents to let him leave. One of the federal agents placed a firm hand on the doctor's chest and shoved him back into his seat. The agent quietly informed him that his medical license was currently under review and his banking records were being actively seized. The doctor collapsed, burying his face in his hands. His lucrative career of destroying the elderly was completely finished. Aaron sat in the center of the total ruin. He was left with absolute, inescapable zero. He had no money. He had no company. He had no collateral. He was facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. The entire psychological fortress he had built to destroy my sanity had collapsed directly onto his own head. He looked at the fake power of attorney documents scattered across the table. He realized he was completely and utterly powerless. But the federal agents were not the ultimate threat. I watched Aaron's eyes dart nervously toward the grand entrance of the restaurant. The realization of his physical reality began to eclipse his legal nightmare. He knew the street lenders monitored public property records. He knew their automated algorithms had already detected the transfer of the lakeside cabin. He knew the syndicate fixers had realized the collateral was gone and the wire transfer was frozen. They knew he had failed, and they knew he had tried to play them for fools. I looked at my heavy diver watch. I told Aaron he had a much bigger problem than a federal indictment. I told him the men managing his debt did not care about court dates or legal jurisdictions. I told him the regional boss of the underground syndicate had issued a direct retrieval order over an hour ago. A sudden commotion echoed from the grand lobby of the Zenith. The heavy glass doors slid open with a violent metallic crash. The hostess let out a sharp gasp of surprise. Heavy boots hit the marble floor, moving with aggressive, coordinated purpose. I looked past Aaron's shoulder toward the entrance. 4 men in thick, dark coats were walking past the reception desk. They completely ignored the protests of the restaurant management. They did not look like wealthy patrons. They looked like professional violence. They scanned the expansive dining room, their cold eyes searching the tables. The tension in our circular booth reached an absolute, unbearable peak. Aaron followed my gaze. He turned his head and saw the men walking onto the main floor. The absolute certainty of his impending death washed over him. The federal agents shifted their stances, recognizing the immediate tactical threat entering the room. Vincent stepped closer to my side, his hand sliding smoothly into his coat. The men from the syndicate spotted Aaron sitting in the center booth. They altered their trajectory, walking straight toward us with terrifying, lethal intent. The digital traps had worked flawlessly, but the physical monsters were finally here to collect their debt. I sat perfectly still and watched them approach. The lead federal agent did not raise his voice, but his tone carried an absolute commanding authority that sliced completely through the dead silence of the luxury dining room. He reached down and pulled Aaron out of his expensive leather chair, twisting his arms behind his back with a practiced fluid motion. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, echoing across the pristine white tablecloth, sounded like a gavel striking a block of solid wood. The agent began to recite the Miranda rights with a cold, routine precision. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words flowed from the agent, filling the circular booth with the inescapable reality of the law. Aaron struggled weakly against the grip, his bespoke Navy suit bunching up awkwardly around his shoulders, but the two agents held him in an unyielding iron vice. He was completely powerless. Natalie began to scream. It was not a scream of defiance or anger, but a high-pitched sound of total, unadulterated panic. Her perfect white dress snagged on the edge of the heavy wooden chair as an agent firmly grasped her wrists and forced them behind her back. The second pair of handcuffs clicked shut with brutal finality. She wept openly, her meticulous makeup running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She begged the federal agents to let her go, claiming she knew absolutely nothing about the money or the assassin on the mountain. She threw her own husband to the wolves in a matter of seconds, proving that their entire marriage was built on a foundation of greedy, fragile lies. She sobbed that she was just a victim of his ambition, but the agents simply pulled her to her feet and ignored her desperate, pathetic pleas. Dr. Evans was the quietest of the three. He stood absolutely frozen, his face drained of all remaining color. When the third federal agent clamped the cold steel cuffs around his wrists, the corrupt psychiatrist merely bowed his head in total defeat. He knew his medical license was gone forever. He knew his freedom was gone. His highly lucrative career of burying the elderly in state-run asylums had ended permanently at this very table. He offered no resistance as they patted him down and confiscated his belongings. The elite patrons of the Zenith restaurant sat in stunned, absolute silence. The wealthy executives and the sharp corporate lawyers who had been secretly judging my faded gray suit just an hour ago were now staring in morbid fascination. The gentle clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of expensive negotiations had completely stopped. They watched as the golden boy of the corporate world was publicly stripped of his dignity and paraded like a common criminal. The flawless illusion of his massive success was completely and utterly shattered for everyone in the city to see. The federal agents turned Aaron toward the main aisle of the restaurant. They marched him forward. His legs barely seemed to support his own body weight. He stumbled, dragging his expensive leather shoes across the polished marble floor. I stepped out of the circular booth and walked slowly behind them. Vincent matched my pace, walking silently at my right side with his hands deep in his wool coat pockets. We followed the procession of ruined lives toward the grand glass entrance of the restaurant lobby. The walk felt incredibly long. Every single step Aaron took was a heavy public admission of his absolute failure. We reached the front lobby just as the brass indicator above the main elevator illuminated with a soft, golden light. The quiet electronic chime signaled the arrival of a car from the ground floor. Aaron lifted his head, his tear-streaked face catching the bright reflections of the crystal lobby chandeliers. He likely hoped the elevator would offer him a quick escape from the hundreds of staring eyes. He was praying for the heavy steel doors to close and hide his profound humiliation from the world. The silver doors slid open with a smooth mechanical whisper, but the elevator car was not empty. 4 men stepped out of the confined space. They were massive, heavily scarred figures, who looked entirely out of place in the pristine high-end environment of the Zenith. They did not wear tailored suits or carry leather briefcases. They wore thick, dark winter coats and heavy work boots that scuffed loudly against the pristine marble. Their faces were carved out of violence and hard, brutal years on unforgiving streets. They carried the heavy, suffocating weight of the criminal underworld directly into the glowing temple of the elite. These were the enforcers for the underground street syndicate. They were the men sent to collect the $3 million Aaron had promised them, or to collect his life in return. The lead enforcer stopped directly in front of the open elevator doors. He was a mountain of a man with a thick, jagged scar running down the side of his jaw. He completely ignored the federal agents. He ignored the stunned hostess standing paralyzed behind her podium. He locked his cold, dead eyes entirely on my son. Aaron stopped breathing. His knees completely buckled, and the two federal agents had to physically haul him upward by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the floor. The violent collision of his two hidden worlds had finally occurred in real time. The federal government held him in steel handcuffs for severe wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder, but the men standing blocking the elevator were there to collect a blood debt for the stolen lakeside cabin. The syndicate had tracked his phone right to this exact floor. They had come to extract their immediate absolute vengeance. The lead enforcer did not say a single word. He did not need to speak. The lethal promise radiating from his silent glare communicated everything Aaron needed to know. He knew that even if he somehow managed to survive the decades in federal prison, the syndicate would be waiting for him every single day behind those high concrete walls. They would never forget the insult of his fake collateral. They would never forgive the disrespect of his digital lies. They would never stop hunting him until the ledger was completely balanced in blood. Aaron broke. The last fragile piece of his arrogant, sociopathic mind snapped cleanly in half. He turned his head and looked at me. His face was soaked with cold sweat and tears. He began to sob with loud, violent, gasping breaths that echoed horribly through the quiet lobby. He threw his weight against the iron grip of the federal agents, desperately trying to move toward me. "Dad, please!" he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to help me. You have to pay them. You have all the money in the holding company. You can fix this right now. Just tell them you will pay the $3 million. They are going to kill me, Dad. They are going to kill me. Please save me." He was sobbing uncontrollably, pleading for the very life he had tried to violently take from me just hours ago. He was begging for the money he had actively tried to steal from my accounts. He was asking for the paternal mercy he had completely denied me when he paid an assassin to run my heavy transport truck off a slick mountain road. I stood perfectly still and looked at the broken boy I had raised. I searched my own heart for a trace of anger or a flicker of sorrow, but the chamber was entirely empty. There was no rage left in my blood. There was only a profound, cold clarity. He was a complete stranger to me. He had severed our blood tie the moment he put a calculated price tag on my existence. I looked him dead in the eye. I kept my posture rigid and my voice completely flat and hollow. "I am a senile old man," I said, my words cutting through the tense air like shards of winter ice. "I do not know what you are talking about." Aaron let out a devastated, wailing scream. It was a sound of absolute, inescapable despair. It was the sound of a man plummeting into a dark, endless abyss, with absolutely nothing left to grab onto. I did not stay to watch the rest of his psychological collapse. I turned my body and walked forward. The four massive men from the street syndicate silently parted, creating a narrow path for me to walk through. They recognized a man who had already finished his heavy work. I walked straight through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the cool, dark night air. The freezing industrial fog had finally lifted, leaving behind a sharp, clear sky. Vincent followed me out into the street. We did not exchange any words. We simply nodded to each other, a silent, solemn acknowledgement that the long, violent night was finally over. The natural order had been restored. The disease had been ruthlessly excised from the body of my life. I walked down the quiet city block until I reached my heavy transport truck. I climbed up into the familiar cab and started the engine, listening to the powerful, comforting rumble of the diesel motor. I drove out of the city limits, leaving the towering glass skyscrapers and the artificial neon lights far behind me in the rearview mirror. I drove for hours, watching the landscape slowly transition from flat concrete highways to winding mountain roads lined with dense, ancient pine trees. I arrived at the lakeside cabin long after midnight. The State Conservancy signs had not yet been posted, but the land felt fundamentally different now. It felt profoundly safe. It felt permanently protected from the greed of the modern world. I parked the truck on the dirt shoulder and walked down the narrow, familiar path toward the water. The lake was perfectly still under the bright silver light of the moon. The surface of the water looked like a massive sheet of dark, polished glass, reflecting the towering, jagged silhouettes of the surrounding mountains. The cold air smelled strongly of wet earth and fresh pine needles. It was the exact scent that Martha had loved more than anything else in the world. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy canvas coat. My fingers brushed against the small, cold plastic casing of the GPS tracking device. It was the mechanical beacon Aaron had used to guide the logging truck to my location. It was the tiny, insidious instrument of my intended murder. I pulled the disconnected tracker from my pocket and held it flat in the palm of my hand. I stared at the dark, dead screen for a long time. The violence and the betrayal of the past 2 days finally felt like a distant, fading storm. I pulled my arm back and threw the tracker as hard as I could over the surface of the lake. I watched the small black square sail through the bright moonlight and disappear into the deep, dark water with a soft, hollow splash. The ripples expanded slowly, moving across the glassy surface until they vanished entirely against the muddy shoreline. I stood alone on the edge of the lake and listened to the profound, infinite silence of the woods. For years, I had treated this silence as a heavy symbol of my deep isolation. I had viewed my quiet, solitary life as a cruel punishment for growing old and becoming irrelevant to a fast-moving world. But as the cool mountain wind swept across the water, I finally realized the silence was not a cage. It was a beautiful sanctuary. It was a lasting testament to my reclaimed peace. I had fought the darkness and I had survived. I had protected the vital legacy Martha and I had built together. The heavy debt was paid, the ledger was entirely clean, and the natural order of the world was finally restored. True power does not demand an audience, but rather operates in the quiet spaces where patience outlasts arrogance. The lesson here is that silence should never be confused with surrender, because the most devastating victories are forged in the shadows and executed with absolute precision. If you are ready to explore the final shattering moments of this confrontation, tell me to proceed to the next segment.